From a refrigerated truck door rolling open on blue-lit plastic to a bathtub rim stained with Trinity's neat red crescents, Miami looks less like a city and more like a crime scene that never ends. Sirens pulse, radios crackle, and right in the middle of it all, Miami Metro keeps insisting it has everything under control. Let's kick things off in pure chaos. Flash. The refrigerated truck crime scenes from Season 1, cops slipping on cold concrete while body parts hang like meat. Flash. Trinity's victims, posed in immaculate, ritualized horror as detectives whisper about patterns they never actually solve. Flash. Miguel Prado, hand wrapped around LaGuertas in front of cameras. A polished handshake, sealing a political alliance we already know is rotten. Through all of it, Dexter walks calmly through the squad room, while alarms blare, the supposed expert in blood, quietly orbiting investigations that are collapsing in real time. Then, we cut to celebrations. Champagne popping in the briefing room. Press conferences with Batista at the podium, LaGuerta promising justice, Deb forced into a blazer, blinking in the spotlight. Applause, flashbulbs, case files stamped closed. But between those claps, we see what they miss. The real killers standing just off camera. Brian Moser in a crowd watching his own crime scene get misread. Trinity walking past a squad car, anonymous in a sea of faces. Miguel smiling at the podium, already planning how to bend the next investigation to his will. In this video, we're going to live in that gap between the performance of success and the reality of failure. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on one bad arrest or one blown lead, but on a repeating pattern where every major case becomes a stage for someone else's plan. And again, Miami Metro plays its role perfectly, for the wrong script. Hard cut, the ice truck killer's severed doll parts, meticulously arranged, a taunt that only Dexter really understands. Smashed to dokes in chains in that remote cabin, the one honest cop who sees through Dexter, reduced to a scapegoat for the Bay Harbor butcher. Deb on the floor of the shipping container, shaking and sobbing under fluorescent light, as Dexter's voiceover from another season bleeds in about precision, control, and a code that supposedly keeps everything clean. How many times can an investigation advertise control while the images scream collapse? We end the montage in silence. No sirens, no press. Just Dexter alone in his lab, fluorescent hum, glass slides glinting like tiny verdicts, case files stacked in front of him, each one neatly stamped closed, each one a story we know is incomplete, misdirected, or flat out wrong. The central question is not whether Miami Metro ever catches anyone. It's how often their victories are illusions, propped up by luck, lies, or killers who let themselves be found. Each major section will trace that trajectory, from the ice truck killer to Trinity to New Blood, to ask when this department wins, who actually pays the price. And that's the turn we need to make now. Because once we strip away the moody voiceover and the triumphant case closed montages, a different story starts to surface. This is not a show about a genius predator hiding inside a well-oiled police machine. It's a show about two myths cracking at the same time. On one side, Dexter's internal narrative tells us he's the ultimate planner. The code, the plastic, the research, the kill rooms, stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the scene, total control. On the other side, Miami Metro walks through those glass doors every morning, believing they're the elite homicide unit in Miami, the last line of defense in a city built on bodies and secrets. But when we line that self-image up against what we actually watched, chaos, misreads, blind spots you could drive a refrigerated truck through, from Brian Moser carving up Miami like a puzzle only Dexter can solve, to Trinity living an entire double life while the task force chases shadows, the focus is not just on who gets caught, it's on how. How does a room full of detectives miss the serial killer working in their own lab? How does the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force rely on Dexter's analysis to hunt Dexter without seriously questioning that conflict of interest? Those aren't one-off failures. They're the operating system. So here's the thesis. Clearly, when we rewatch the series, Dexter's life is not defined by control. It's defined by how often his plans and Miami Metro's investigations collapse in slow motion, side by side. His code promises precision and safety, yet season after season, we watch that promise disintegrate into improvised cover stories, emergency body disposals, and collateral damage. Their badges promise order and justice, yet case after case resolves through luck, vigilantes, or killers, manipulating the investigation from inside the building. To keep this clear, we're going to stop treating Miami Metro as just a backdrop for Dexter's psychology and start treating it as a character in its own right. This institution has a personality. It craves headlines, folds under political pressure, clings to convenient suspects, and keeps getting played by killers, politicians, and its own people. Brian turns their crime scenes into a private conversation with Dexter. Miguel Prado uses departmental politics and access to case files to advance his personal kill agenda. Trinity walks through their manhunts untouched because their profile of him is more comforting than the boring reality of a family man in the suburbs. In this video, we're going to track plans, not just bodies. What Miami Metro thinks is happening versus what's actually unfolding in the shadows. Each major section will map one investigation against the secret game running beneath it, from the ice truck killer to Bay Harbor to Trinity and beyond. And along the way, one question will keep getting louder. If this many killers can move through those glass doors unnoticed, how much of Miami Metro's success is anything more than luck waiting to run out? So if Miami Metro's victories are mostly luck waiting to expire, how do we actually measure their failures? To keep this clear, we're not just pointing at every dead end on the evidence board. We're tracking the moments where the institution itself, those glass walls, those briefing rooms, those press conferences, puts a plan in motion, only to have that plan quietly hijacked by someone much smarter in the room. The focus is not just on individual detectives having bad days. We're treating Miami Metro as a single investigative organism, task forces assembled under political pressure, interrogations designed to squeeze convenient suspects, manhunts shaped by press leaks and mayoral phone calls. When that organism commits to a trajectory, this is our guy. This profile is correct. This task force is airtight. That's when the real collapse becomes visible. In this video, we're going to treat each major failure as a planned case study. What did Miami Metro think was happening? What safeguards did they believe guaranteed control, lab protocols, surveillance, internal affairs, interagency cooperation? Then, frame by frame, we'll isolate the precise moment where a killer steps around those safeguards. Brian Moser leaving body parts as a private conversation with Dexter, while the official investigation chases a faceless ice truck phantom. The Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force relying on Dexter's blood analysis to hunt Dexter. Trinity walking through their manhunts as a church-going family man who never fits the profile they're so confident in. Along the way, we'll keep circling three recurring dynamics. First, tunnel vision, the instinct to lock on to the most convenient suspect. Dokes, any drifter who fits a tabloid headline, and then interpret every piece of evidence as confirmation. Second, overconfidence in their own profiles and procedures, as if putting a label on a killer's psychology automatically means they understand his plan. Third, a chronic underestimation of how intelligent, adaptive, and patient these killers are, especially when those killers are literally reading case files over the detective's shoulders. Not every misstep counts as systemic failure. People get lucky. Witnesses misremember. A traffic stop goes the wrong way. We're not here to nitpick every coincidence. The central question is, where do the same blind spots repeat, season after season, even as the faces of the killers change? When Miguel Prado can bend the department's politics to shield his own murders, when Trinity evades multiple task force pushes, when New Blood echoes the same patterns in a different town, we're looking at structure, not accident. And we're not just here to mock incompetence. There's real psychology under all this. Why does a department that has stared serial murder in the face, year after year, keep defaulting to the same fragile sense of control? What does it do to a detective's mind to live in a city where monsters keep walking out of the station unscathed? In the next section, we'll start where the pattern begins. Miami Metro's first dance with a killer who knows their blind spots better than they do, the ice truck killer. So before we dive into the ice truck killer's first move, we need one more tool, a way to name the different ways Miami Metro loses control. Because not every failure is the same kind of collapse. Some are about bad police work. Some are about bad judgment. And some are about reality itself being wrong. To keep this clear, we're going to track 3 categories: operational failures, relational failures, and existential failures. Think of them as 3 layers of the same broken system: the surface level, where the investigation misfires; the human level, where psychology and emotion twist the facts; and the deep level, where the entire story, Miami Metro, is telling itself about a case, turns out to be a lie. Let's kick things off with operational failures. These are the nuts and bolts breakdowns: evidence mishandled, surveillance misdirected, suspect lists warped by bias or pressure. When Miami Metro's concrete work is outmaneuvered or outright manipulated. The Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force is the purest example. They literally rely on Dexter's blood analysis to hunt the Bay Harbor Butcher, never pausing on the conflict of interest screaming in their faces. Dokes ends up framed as the killer, not because the evidence is strong, but because the real killer understands their procedures better than they do. That is operational failure, the investigation doing exactly what the killer needs it to do. Relational failures cut closer to the bone. These are the collapses born from trust, ambition, and the politics of the bullpen. The focus is not just on clues, but on who's allowed inside the circle of trust. Miguel Prado walks straight through that door. As a high-profile prosecutor and Dexter's supposed friend, he gains access to case files, to strategy meetings, to the emotional blind spots of everyone in the building. Miami Metro doesn't just miss his corruption, they feed it, because his rage lines up with what they want to believe about justice, when personal loyalty rewrites what counts as suspicious. The investigation is already compromised. Then there are the existential failures, where the entire frame of the case is wrong. This is Miami Metro hunting a monster that doesn't exist, while the real one lives a quiet life in suburbia. The Trinity killer is the emblem here. A ghost with a decades-long pattern, profiled as an isolated, almost mythical predator. Turns out to be Arthur Mitchell, church deacon, family man, building houses for charity. Every briefing, every profile, every press conference is built on the assumption that someone like him could never be the killer. When that assumption shatters, it's not just a bad lead, it's a worldview collapsing. Along the way, we'll see these categories overlap. Dokes, as the Bay Harbor Butcher, sits at the intersection of operational tunnel vision and relational bias. Miguel Prado is a relational disaster that bleeds into operational chaos. Trinity is an existential failure that exposes how fragile every prior win really was. In this video, we're going to move season by season, tagging each major investigation with these three labels and watching how the failures escalate. Early on, the damage is contained to a case file or a single scapegoat. By the time we reach New Blood, the trajectory has shifted. The cost of each misread plan is an entire community. Next, we start at the beginning of that arc, with Miami Metro's first great misreading, the ice truck killer teaching them how blind they really are. So to keep this clear, we're not just jumping around the greatest hits of Miami Metro incompetence. We're going to walk straight through the timeline, from the first chopped up Barbie parts on Dexter's windshield to the last body cooling under Iron Lake's snow, and watch the illusion of control peel away layer by layer. We start where the show starts, the ice truck killer. On the surface, it's Miami Metro's first big serial investigation, a classic cat and mouse. In reality, Brian is running two parallel games. One is for the task force, with neatly posed bodies and freezer trucks. The other is for Dexter alone, with childhood crime scenes recreated in melted blood and clues only he can decode. Miami Metro builds profiles, holds press conferences, celebrates partial victories, but every time they think the investigation is tightening, Brian pivots, and the case quietly becomes a private conversation they're not actually invited to. How do you catch a killer when you don't even realize he's talking past you? From there, we move into the Bay Harbor Butcher arc, where the failure becomes systemic. The central question is, what happens when the investigation is literally powered by the killer's own analysis? In this video, we're going to trace how a task force, armed with federal resources and mounting bodies, still funnels every major decision through Dexter's lab reports. Doak's instincts, Lundy's methodology, Laguerta's suspicions, each gets close, then gets redirected. The department convinces itself it has found its monster in Doak's, and the case closes, but the real butcher is still clocking in at Miami Metro every morning. Each major section will keep escalating that pattern. Miguel Prado's season turns the squad room into a political chessboard, where investigations are steered to protect careers and vendettas instead of truth. Trinity's suburban nightmare shows us a killer hiding in plain sight, attending the same task force briefings that are supposed to bring him down. Later seasons bring in copycats and legacy killers, people like Jordan Chase's Circle, the Barrel Girls' conspirators, and eventually the shadow of Dexter himself, who weaponize, leaks, media pressure, and Miami Metro's tunnel vision to stay one step ahead. The focus is not just on the headline cases, but on 1 to 3 pivotal investigations per season where the department believes the plan is working. They have the right suspect, the right pattern, the right psychological profile. Then, a missing body, a bad arrest, or a manipulated piece of evidence flips the board, and we see the same blind spots resurfacing with higher consequences. Along the way, we'll keep looping back to earlier failures, asking, what did they refuse to learn here that makes the next disaster possible? By the time we reach New Blood, those blind spots have literally crossed state lines. The myth that Miami Metro ever had this under control has collapsed. And the Bay Harbor Butcher has become a story, a legend, a template for new violence. The final question is not just how Dexter falls, but how far the damage spreads when a department misreads the same pattern for a decade. And to see that, we have to go back to that first refrigerated truck and watch the mistakes begin in real time. We go back to that first refrigerated truck, and right away, the illusion of control is already broken. Miami Metro thinks it's opening a clean new case file. In reality, it's walking into a story Brian Moser has already outlined, storyboarded, and cast. Let's kick things off with their initial reaction. A dismembered body, no blood, careful staging. The task force spins up in textbook fashion. LaGorta jockeying for camera time, Dokes radiating suspicion at every suspect in the room, Masuka drooling over trace evidence, and Dexter quietly reading the scene. The profile they build is comfortingly familiar. Organized offender, ritualistic, escalating, a predator who hunts the city at random. In other words, a problem they've solved on paper 100 times before, but the central question they never ask is, who is this for? Because Brian is not just killing, he's directing. Painted fingernails left for Dexter to find, a decapitated head placed on a Barbie doll body, echoing childhood trauma no one else even knows exists. A severed hand delivered to Dexter's apartment, posed in a freezer like a private joke. To keep this clear, these are not generic signatures. They're personalized callbacks to a shared origin in blood. Miami Metro treats every one of those moments as evidence to plug into a profile. Nail color becomes a quirk. Doll parts become a fetish. The refrigerated truck is a mobile crime scene, not a stage. They feed everything into behavioral psychology templates, running probability trees, while the real meaning sits inches away from Dexter's face. The focus is not just on what they miss, but how they miss it. They assume the killer is talking to them, to the institution, when he is very specifically writing to someone inside their own building. Operationally, that's the first major failure. They never entertain the possibility that the investigation itself is being choreographed. No one asks why the killer keeps giving them pristine tableau instead of messy dumps. No one questions why Dexter, of all people, keeps ending up alone with the best clues. The plan is always the same. Process, profile, pressure the streets. And that plan collapses the moment they're dealing with someone who is not trying to hide from them, but to guide one of their own. Then there's the relational blind spot. Deb is desperate to escape vice and prove herself in homicide, so she charges at the ice truck case with everything she has. She dates a charming prosthetics expert. She pushes to be included in briefings. She rides the adrenaline of being near real murder. And yet, no one stops to ask whether her sudden proximity to Dexter on this case is part of the killer's design. Why does the man she's falling for know so much about dismemberment? Why does he orbit Dexter's world so easily? The department reads Deb's ambition as office politics, not as a vulnerability being actively exploited. Along the way, Brian steers them toward what looks like progress. More bodies, more clues, more pressure. Miami Metro feels the net tightening. They think the trajectory is converging on an arrest. But the real endgame is assembling quietly around a rusted shipping container and a childhood crime scene they've never truly uncovered. By the time they believe they're closing in, the final act will already be underway, entirely outside their field of vision. We end on that rusted shipping container, but we have to rewind to the doll parts and the porcelain bodies that were supposed to point Miami Metro straight at it. From a bloodless corpse laid out like a mannequin to tiny plastic limbs chilling in Dexter's freezer. Brian isn't just taunting the department. He's writing a biography. They never learned to read it. Let's kick things off with that early crime scene. The dismembered, bloodless body, each limb wrapped, surfaces scrubbed, joints separated with surgical precision. The investigation locks onto technique. They talk scalpels, medical training, refrigeration. They marvel at how clean it is. But the central question never lands. Where is all the blood? In a show obsessed with spatter, the total absence of it should be deafening. Instead, Miami Metro treats it as a technical puzzle, not a psychological thesis about a killer reenacting a childhood slaughter inside a shipping container. To keep this clear, Brian is staging a negative image of Dexter's origin. No blood, no mess, no chaos. A fantasy version of that night. Miami Metro doesn't ask why the killer is so fixated on cleanliness or what kind of trauma would make someone erase every drop. They chase a profile. They don't chase a story. Then the doll parts start appearing in Dexter's life. A tiny severed hand in his freezer. A head in his fridge. A full doll, reassembled and left in his apartment, dressed like a corpse from his past. The audience feels the trap closing. We know these are messages. We know the plan is personal. Yet inside the show, the department never even flirts with the idea that the ice truck killer might be targeting someone on the team. A homicide squad, surrounded by staged tableau, can't conceive that their own star analyst is the main character in the narrative. The focus is not just on what they miss, but how they miss it. Operationally, they treat each scene as isolated. One body here, one dump site there, a random doll at a crime scene, a random doll in evidence. Brian is building a serialized story, escalating from anonymous victims to directly invading Dexter's home, mirroring the way Dexter's childhood trauma invaded every corner of his adult life. Miami Metro files each escalation under new clue instead of same sentence. That's a structural failure of context. And Dexter himself quietly reinforces it. As blood spatter analyst, he's the one who should be screaming about the missing blood, about the ritual repetition, about the personal targeting. Instead, he nudges interpretations toward the abstract, a meticulous killer, a need for control, a generic cat and mouse plan. He never suggests an inside connection, never opens the door to the possibility that the killer is reconstructing him. Why would he invite that collapse? Existentially, this is where the investigation breaks. Miami Metro believes they're hunting a stranger in the city, some external monster stalking Miami's streets. They never imagine the killer is reconstructing their colleague's origin story, frame by frame, right under the fluorescent lights of their own squad room. Along the way, every missed pattern here will echo in future seasons, as other killers exploit the same blind spot, the refusal to see that the real horror is already sitting at the table. So when the next predator walks through those doors with a friendly smile and a case file in hand, will anyone notice? And no one notices faster than Deborah Morgan. When we meet her in Vice, Deb is literally working the streets, begging for a shot at homicide while wearing a wig and fishnets. That image is more than color. It's the psychology of a detective who believes her entire trajectory depends on one big case, one big break, one chance to prove she belongs under those fluorescent lights with the real players. The ice truck killer watches that desperation and writes a plan around it. Brian doesn't just appear as a random nice guy. He reverse engineers the perfect boyfriend persona from everything Miami Metro leaves lying around in plain sight. He knows Deb is lonely, that she idolizes Dexter, that she's aching to be taken seriously. So he shows up as Rudy, the sensitive prosthetics artist, who loves her ambition, listens to her case gossip, and never flinches at the gruesome details. From dinners to pillow talk, he's turning a promotion fantasy into a hunting blind. To keep this clear, the failure isn't just that Deb falls for him, it's that the entire squad lets her. We're in the middle of an active serial investigation, with a killer who is clearly watching the department, and yet no one runs a real background check on the new man orbiting a detective who is directly attached to the case. No one asks whether there's a conflict of interest when Deb starts dating while she's chasing the ice truck killer. No one even pretends to have a protocol. LaGuerta is busy using the ice truck case as a press conference springboard, angling for quotes, camera angles, and leverage over Matthews. Matthews is focused on numbers, clearances, and who gets credit if this thing wraps clean. The focus is not just on catching a killer, but on who gets promoted when the killer is caught. In that atmosphere, Deb's sudden glow, her new relationship, her proximity to the big case, that reads as momentum, not a red flag. Operationally, it's a collapse in slow motion. They know the ice truck killer is obsessed with Dexter. They know he's staging bodies as messages. They openly discuss that the killer is studying them. Yet there is no meaningful protocol to monitor detectives' personal lives, no security briefing about dating, no surveillance on obvious entry points like ride-alongs, crime scene vendors, or, in Deb's case, the man she's sleeping next to. What happens when the investigation walks straight into the bedroom? The answer arrives in a shipping container. Deb wakes up strapped to a table, the walls painted with her childhood trauma, her promotion dream weaponized into Brian's endgame tableau. Miami Metro doesn't prevent it. They respond to it. Sirens after the fact. Tactical teams chasing an absence. This is the pattern that will define the next several seasons. They don't anticipate the killer's plan. They scramble around its aftermath. And as Dexter steps into that container, forced to choose between his sister and his brother, we're left with the central question. If they miss this, what else are they already too late to stop? And the uncomfortable answer is almost everything. Because the very next phase of this investigation has Miami Metro doing something that feels impossible in a homicide unit. They stand next to the killer. They shake his hand. They let him date one of their own. Let's kick things off with those early hospital scenes. Deb is lying in a bed, bandaged and traumatized, and Brian Moser walks in as the attentive, slightly awkward prosthetics guy. Flowers in hand, soft voice. 0 red flags. The squad treats him like background furniture, a helpful civilian orbiting their case, not the architect of the bodies they've been chasing all season. From a distance, it looks harmless. Up close, it's a total operational failure. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on the fact that Brian is there. It's how easily he gets there. No serious background check. No deep dive into his proximity to multiple crime scenes. Deb starts dating him in the middle of an escalating serial investigation, and the department's response is light teasing. In what universe does a task force hunting a dismemberment killer not aggressively vet every new person entering a detective's life? This is where the psychology of the investigation quietly collapses. They're hunting a monster, so they expect the ice truck killer to look like one. Someone visibly off, aggressive, socially broken. Brian is the opposite, charming enough, helpful. A man with a job that conveniently explains his knowledge of bodies and blood. Because he blends into the scenery, he slides right past their threat profile. The central question they never ask is brutally simple. What if the killer looks normal? And Dexter, standing in the middle of all this, is split down the middle. He's curious. He feels the pull of the clues Brian leaves just for him. But he's also protecting his own secret, managing his own plan, and that divided focus becomes its own kind of complicity. He doesn't push the department to look harder at Brian. He doesn't weaponize his instincts the way he later will with Trinity. His silence reinforces their complacency. Here's the pattern interrupt. Brian doesn't hack the system. He doesn't out-tech them. He outweights them. He uses nothing but their assumptions, their blind trust in their own profiles, and the emotional distraction of Deb's romance to move freely in and out of their orbit. Each major section will show this same structure repeating. From Brian to Trinity, Miami Metro will stand inches away from the truth, sharing crime scenes, press conferences, even family dinners, and still not see it until the damage is irreversible. In the next phase, when the Bay Harbor butcher case turns inward, that blindness won't just let a killer walk past them. It will let a killer run the investigation himself. When the first garbage bag breaks the surface of Biscayne Bay, we're watching two stories rise at once. a decade of Dexter's perfect disposal plan literally floats back up, and Miami Metro's credibility starts to sink. Black plastic, swollen limbs, divers pulling up piece after piece while news choppers orbit overhead. This isn't a quiet crime scene. It's a live broadcast indictment of everything the department thinks it has under control. The central question becomes brutally simple. How many bodies can surface before someone asks why nobody at Miami Metro noticed they were missing? Reporters swarm the docks, City Hall lights up LaGuardia's phone, and overnight the department's failure stops being theoretical. There are cameras in their squad room. There are headlines using the phrase systemic collapse. This isn't just another serial killer investigation. It's an audit of the entire homicide division, conducted in real time with the dead as evidence. To keep this clear, the response is textbook bureaucracy under siege. Create a task force. Brand the threat. The Bay Harbor Butcher gets a name, a logo on the evidence board, its own war room. And at the analytical center of that war room, they place Dexter Morgan. The man whose ocean dumps are being exhumed becomes the official interpreter of the killer's psychology and methods. No one in leadership seriously pauses on the conflict of interest baked into that decision. On paper, it makes sense. Who better to read the blood, the cut marks, the plastic wrap, than the blood spatter analyst who's seen it all? In practice, it's catastrophic. They are outsourcing their understanding of the butcher's plan to the one person in Miami whose work it directly mirrors. Every time Dexter stands in front of that board and calmly explains the butcher's ritual, he is describing his own code back to them. He talks about victim selection, careful preparation, clean kills, ocean disposal. They nod. They take notes. They never turn around and ask why his insight is so precise. The focus is not just on a missed hunch, it's on institutional psychology. Under pressure, the department chooses comfort over scrutiny. Dexter is familiar. Dexter is helpful. Dexter is the guy who brings donuts and solves blood puzzles. Questioning him would mean questioning the lab, the hiring practices, the entire trajectory of cases he's touched. So they don't. They let the killer run quality control on his own exposure. And the stakes are existential. If the Bay Harbor Butcher really is one of theirs, then every closed file becomes suspect. Every solved case potentially contaminated. Careers, pensions, the thin story they tell the public about law and order, all of it is on the line. So the investigation bends toward face-saving outcomes. They need a narrative where Miami Metro is hunting a monster, not harboring one. Along the way, that need opens the door for the neatest solution of all, a convenient scapegoat. As suspicion drifts toward Sergeant James Dokes, we'll watch the department's desperation meet Dexter's need for survival, and the Bay Harbor Butcher himself will start helping them close the case on the wrong man. And that's where the investigation takes its most surreal turn. The fox doesn't just wander into the henhouse. Miami Metro hands him a desk and a whiteboard. Dexter isn't on the Bay Harbor Butcher task force as a peripheral tech. He is the task force's nervous system. To keep this clear, we have to sit with the absurdity of those scenes. Dexter stands over dismembered bodies, analyzing cut marks that he created, explaining ocean currents he personally tested with garbage bags full of his own victims. He outlines victim selection patterns that are, beat for beat, his private hunting log. And everyone around him nods, treating him as a neutral interpreter of the evidence, not the author of the crime scene. The central question becomes impossible to ignore. How can an investigation maintain control when the prime architect of the murders is the one defining what the pattern even is? On paper, this should be the most high-stakes operation Miami Metro has ever run. Multiple dump sites, dozens of bodies, federal pressure. Instead, structurally, It's a textbook failure of oversight. There's no independent forensic review of the slides, no external consultants brought in to recheck cut angles or disposal methods. No one seriously floats the idea that the butcher might be someone with unrestricted access to evidence, lab space, and crime scene reports. They talk about a meticulous monster out there in the city, while the camera calmly cuts to Dexter in the next room, labeling blood. From there, his control over the investigation doesn't require genius, just proximity and trust. He steers conclusions in small, almost invisible ways. He emphasizes that the victims are all criminals, subtly framing the butcher as a vigilante rather than a cop. He talks up the logistics of boat access, pushing attention outward to docks and marinas instead of inward to the department garage. When a detail threatens to point too close to home, he calls it inconclusive, or statistically meaningless, or not enough to build a profile on yet. Each major section will show a similar maneuver, highlight one trait, bury another, and the entire trajectory of the case shifts a few crucial degrees. And because of the relational psychology in that squad room, nobody pushes back. Batista trusts Dexter as the quiet blood guy who helped close countless cases. Deb sees a damaged, awkward brother, not a strategic threat. Even Lundy, with all his experience, treats Dexter as a useful specialist rather than a potential conflict of interest. How do you accuse the person who translates reality for you of falsifying the map? The irony is brutal. Miami Metro's best chance to catch the Bay Harbor butcher is the butcher himself, and he's the one writing their playbook. In this video, we're going to keep tracking how that pattern repeats every time the department outsources its judgment to the most convenient expert. It hands control to the very people it should fear, because once Dexter learns he can survive being at the center of his own manhunt, the next step is inevitable. He's going to need someone else to carry the blame. So once Dexter realizes he needs a scapegoat, the trajectory of the Bay Harbor butcher investigation twists into something darker. It stops being a hunt for a killer and becomes a hunt for James Dokes. We watch a whole department, under pressure, grab the easiest narrative, and never let go. Let's kick things off with that shift from vague suspicion to full-blown obsession. Early on, Dokes is just the guy who doesn't buy Dexter's nice guy act. He snaps at suspects, he has a special forces background, he openly stalks Dexter instead of pretending they're work friends. All of that is messy, but none of it is evidence. Yet, as the bodies pile up and the media screams for a monster, those personality traits quietly harden into profile matches. The temper becomes violent potential, the military history becomes trained killer, the distrust of Dexter becomes defensive projection. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on what they find, but how they interpret it. Once Dokes lands on the internal radar, every ambiguous detail tilts his way. He disappears from work, must be on the run. He's been digging into Dexter's past, must be covering his own. Even the fact that he's off the grid when new bodies stop appearing is read as proof of guilt, not as a clue that maybe the real Bay Harbor butcher is adapting the plan. Exculpatory details, his consistent pursuit of Dexter, his lack of forensic access, his absence from key dump site windows, get minimized, pushed aside as inconvenient outliers. In that fog, LaGuerta becomes the lone voice saying, wait. She pulls old files, revisits timelines, actually reopens the investigation instead of just the politics around it. But the psychology of the squad is already locked. Her resistance is framed as ambition, nostalgia, for her partnership with Dokes a career move. The central question she's asking, does the evidence truly align with this man we knew, is downgraded to office gossip about her motives. Along the way, any challenge to the consensus looks like disloyalty, not due diligence. This is where the relational failure bites. Personal grudges, whispered stories about Doak's anger issues, casual jokes in the bullpen. These shape the narrative more than blood work or timelines. Dexter doesn't have to outthink a room full of detectives. He just has to feed the story they already want. A blood slide here, a gym bag in a trunk, a cabin in the Everglades. He's not fighting their investigation. He's steering it. And then the cabin explodes. Dokes dies in a blast Leela orchestrates, and the collapse is immediate and total. Charred remains, planted evidence, a dead internal suspect, it all lands like a gift-wrapped solution. Miami Metro exhales, calls it closure, and the file effectively seals itself. Who, after all, wants to reopen the possibility that the entire department framed the wrong man and let the real butcher walk back into their lab? That question will matter later when another easy answer shows up, and this time, it isn't just a colleague on the line. So when the cameras go up and LaGuardia steps to the podium, we're not just watching a press conference. We're watching an entire institution decide what story it's going to live inside. Dokes is dead, the cabin is ash, the barrels are exhumed, and the phrase, Bay Harbor Butcher, finally has a face they can feed to the public. Inside Miami Metro, you can feel the pressure valve release. Applause in the briefing room, relieved glances over styrofoam coffee, the quiet, guilty pleasure of a case file stamped closed. Reputation salvaged. Narrative restored. The investigation that once threatened to expose their blind spots is now recast as a triumph of police work. They caught one of their own. They were brave enough to look inward. That's the line, repeated to the press and to themselves, until it hardens into common sense. But the central question sitting under all that relief is brutal. How much doubt are they willing to live with? Because the evidence against Dokes is convenient, circumstantial, and perfectly timed. He runs. He has a temper. He's been hounding Dexter. Leela's explosion erases the one location that could complicate the story. To keep this clear, Miami Metro isn't just fooled. They choose to be finished. They choose institutional stability over the messy, destabilizing work of asking who had the access, the knowledge, and the psychological profile to actually be the butcher. From here, the failure stops being purely operational and becomes existential. By accepting a shaky resolution, they build a blind spot directly into the department's DNA. It never fully closes. It just gets wallpapered over with commendations and press clippings. And right in the middle of that blind spot, almost painfully visible to us, stands Dexter Morgan in his lab coat. Every time Dexter walks through the bullpen, every time he pulls a blood slide from a crime scene and narrates the pattern for them, his presence is a quiet indictment the characters never articulate. How does a room full of homicide detectives miss the serial killer working in their own lab? In this video, we're going to keep circling that gap between what they see and what they refuse to see, because that's where Miami Metro's trajectory really collapses. Watch what happens in later seasons. A meticulous dismemberment here, a ritualistic dump site there, a killer who tracks police movements with uncanny precision. Trinity hides in plain sight as a family man. Miguel Prado bends investigations around his personal vendettas. Cases echo the Bay Harbor Butcher's planning and control, but no one seriously reopens the old conclusion. The focus is not just on their missed clues, it's on their refusal to revisit the one investigation that would implicate their own judgment. Here's the pattern interrupt. After Dokes, every convenient suspect is easier to accept. Another confession. Another lone wolf. Another file closed before the consequences fully land. Each major section of Dexter's life, from this point on, plays out against that backdrop of denial. Miami Metro isn't just being outsmarted anymore. They're complicit in maintaining the lie that lets the real butcher keep clocking in. And that complicity will matter when the next investigation doesn't just threaten their record, but their entire belief about who among them is actually safe. So when season 3 opens and Miguel Prado walks through Miami Metro's front doors, we're not watching an outsider infiltrate the fortress. We're watching the fortress swing its gates wide open, lay down a red carpet, and hand him the keys. This isn't a cat and mouse intruder. This is a celebrated ally stepping directly into the command center. Miguel isn't just any Ada. He's a high-profile prosecutor with a last name every cop in that building recognizes. He knows the politics, the pressure from City Hall, the way a bad clearance rate can end a career. He's shaken hands at retirement parties, stood at podiums after big arrests, and built a reputation as the guy who turns Miami Metro's messy investigations into courtroom victories. To keep this clear, he arrives already woven into their story, not as a question mark, but as proof their system works. And then, his brother ends up on Dexter's table. That single death fuses his personal vendetta to the department's homicide work and to Dexter's secret life in one move. What for Dexter is just another righteous application of the code becomes, for Miguel, a raw wound that demands justice, closure, control. Miguel doesn't approach the case as a detached professional. He walks straight into the morgue and the briefing room, with grief, rage, and institutional power all braided together. The central question becomes, what happens when a man like that decides the normal rules are optional? Miami Metro never even thinks to ask it. They see Miguel exactly how he wants to be seen. Batista treats him like a moral ally who cares about victims. LaGuerta sees a political asset, a chance to align the department with a rising star in the Dawes office. Along the way, every shared drink, every hallway conversation, every we're on the same side speech deepens the illusion. The focus is not just on solving a murder, it's on maintaining a relationship that looks good on paper. And that's the relational failure. No one in that building imagines that Miguel could be a threat, much less a corrupting force. They worry about media leaks, budget cuts, career trajectories. They don't worry about the Ada quietly rewriting the moral code of the entire operation. Because once Miguel is in, he's in. He gets access to case files, evidence, and the back-channel gossip that really runs Miami Metro. He can lean on detectives, steer priorities, and frame his own narrative about which monsters deserve attention and which technicalities can be ignored. How do you investigate a collapse that's being directed from inside your own chain of command? From there, the trajectory darkens. Miguel isn't just outsmarting Miami Metro, he's about to collaborate with Dexter himself, building a parallel justice system right under their noses. And when the lab's quiet blood spatter expert starts training a righteous Ada in how to kill, we move into a kind of failure this department is completely unequipped to even imagine, let alone detect. Miguel doesn't just step into Dexter's shadow. He weaponizes the entire justice system's hunger for a win, and Miami Metro holds the door open for him. Let's kick things off with the Oscar Prado case. Miguel storms into the bullpen, grief and rage barely contained, and immediately starts leaning on the detectives to nail Tegan Campbell's killer. On paper, it looks like righteous focus, a high-profile Ada demanding justice for his murdered brother. But watch how he steers the investigation. He keeps pointing them toward the gang angle, toward usual animals, not because the evidence demands it, but because his psychology does. He wants someone to pay. Now, to keep this clear, Miguel's plan is never just about the file in front of him. It's about control. He pressures Deb and the others to move faster, to lock in suspects before the case can breathe, framing every hesitation as weakness. When he fixates on Ellen Wolf later in the season, we see the same pattern. He uses his authority to whisper in Batista's ear, to nudge patrol, to make sure every rumor about her supposed corruption finds its way into the official narrative. Personal vendetta masquerading as professional zeal. Operationally, this is where the real failure appears. Prosecutors are supposed to be a check on police power, the ones who say, "Slow down, this won't hold up." Instead, Miguel is effectively co-running investigations. He's in the squad room strategy sessions. He's suggesting angles, leaning over case boards, pushing for warrants the second a name surfaces. The roles blur, then collapse. The person who should be asking, "Do we have enough?" is the loudest voice saying, "Who cares? Bring him in." And because he's charismatic, it feels natural. He jokes with Batista in Spanish, swaps family stories, shares that cultural shorthand that makes him seem like one of their own. Along the way, that familiarity disarms the very people who should be most suspicious of his access. When an Audit is this involved, shouldn't someone ask why he's so personally invested in each arrest? Red flags do appear. Miguel's temper flares when a suspect walks. He talks about animals and real justice, with a heat that makes Dexter's code look almost measured. He obsesses over certain criminals, revisits their files, pushes for harsher charges, but every time, Miami Metro rationalizes it away because he delivers. He wins cases. He makes the department look effective on paper. That's the pattern. Miami Metro rewards results, not process. Clearance rates, headlines, courtroom victories become the metric of success, which means anyone who can game those numbers can own the trajectory of an investigation. Miguel learns that fast. Dexter will learn it faster. Because once Miguel turns that same machinery toward vigilante killing, the department's blind trust doesn't just enable one man's vendetta, it creates the perfect cover for a partnership built entirely on hidden bodies and invisible consequences. And when that partnership fractures, the system Miguel bent will be too compromised to see the break until it's already bleeding. Miguel doesn't just bend the system from the outside, he walks straight into its heart. And Miami Metro, already leaning on his status, hands him the keys. Let's kick things off with the psychology of that shift. What begins as charged glances in hallways and late-night strategy sessions between LaGuerta and Miguel slowly mutates into something much more dangerous. A relationship where pillow talk and case talk are the same thing. The plan is mutual advantage. She gets proximity to power and a star prosecutor who gets her. He gets an internal advocate with command-level access. On paper, it looks like alignment. In practice, it's a total collapse of oversight. We watch the flirtation slide into romance almost imperceptibly. A shared drink after a tough hearing. A hand on a shoulder that lingers a beat too long. Then dinners, then sleepovers, then the unspoken assumption that their wins are collective wins. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on who's sleeping with whom, it's on how that intimacy rewires the investigation itself. The person best positioned to question Miguel's sudden influence over priorities, leaks, and media spin is now emotionally invested in proving he's right. That's the relational failure. LaGuerta's instincts are sharp. We've already seen her sniff out internal corruption and political games. But once Miguel is in her bed, her skepticism gets redirected outward. Doubts about him become doubts about his enemies. Concerns about his temper become excuses about stress when he pushes for certain suspects, certain neighborhoods, certain narratives. She doesn't ask, "What is he hiding?" She asks, "How do I support him without losing control of my own command?" Meanwhile, the office feels the shift. Gossip travels faster than any official memo. Detectives crack quiet jokes about LaGuerta and Miguel, but underneath the snark is real calculation. Who wants to be the one to raise a concern about Miguel's ethics when he's literally sharing a bed with the lieutenant who controls your evaluations, your overtime, your next promotion? The power dynamic becomes its own gag order. Even when people sense something is off, the safest plan is silence. Operationally, the consequences are everywhere and nowhere. Case assignments tilt subtly toward Miguel's interests. Resources flow to investigations that make him look decisive and away from threads that might expose his extracurricular justice. Media strategy gets massaged, so Miguel is the face of progress, even when the investigation is stuck. Conflicts of interest remain unspoken, because naming them would mean challenging both a beloved prosecutor and the chain of command. In this video, we're going to keep returning to this pattern, personal loyalty masquerading as professional judgment until the investigation itself is compromised. Miguel's affair with Lagerta is not a side plot. It's the mechanism that lets a serial collaborator steer a major metropolitan homicide unit without ever flashing a badge. And here's the bleakest part. Dexter will eventually remove Miguel from the board, but Miami Metro will never map how close they came to being permanently captured. They won't audit the cases he warped, the suspects he redirected, the bodies that vanished in the gaps. Which raises the central question for the next phase of this story. If the department can't even see the wound, what happens when the next predator learns to press on the same soft spots? If Miguel was the warning shot, Trinity is the full structural collapse. We move from a corrupt prosecutor warping a handful of cases to a ghost who's been killing for decades, while Miami Metro builds its reputation on the same streets he walks every day. Let's kick things off with that first Trinity kill we see. A woman in a high-rise bathroom, stripped of comfort and privacy, stepping onto a plastic-covered floor as steam fogs the mirror. Trinity's reflection appears behind her, razor in hand, as he forces a confession and stages her suicide over the balcony. One body, three images. The pleading face, the slashed thigh, the fall. It's ritual, not impulse. It's a pattern that's been repeating since before most of these detectives had their badges. From the outside, Miami Metro treats it as just another high-pressure case. A jump, a cut, a tragic statistic in a city that runs on them. But the federal files tell a different story. When Lundy walks back into their squad room with a box of evidence and a name, Trinity, the central question is unavoidable. How did a serial killer with a clear cycle, a consistent signature, and a cross-country body count operate for 30 years without this department even realizing he existed? To keep this clear, Lundy's return isn't just fan service. It's an indictment. The moment the feds roll in, we see the gap between Miami Metro's self-image as top-tier homicide and the reality of their investigative reach. Their plan has always been reactive: catch the case, follow the leads, close the file. Trinity exposes the failure inside that plan. He's been hitting multiple jurisdictions, exploiting exactly what we've been tracking all along: tunnel vision. Political pressure, and a belief that if the crime scene looks contained, the story must be too. And then we meet Arthur Mitchell, church deacon, devoted husband, charity builder who literally pours concrete for homes instead of dumping bodies beneath them. On paper, he is everything the standard predator profile is not. He cries in public, he mentors teenagers, he leads prayer circles. The psychology Miami Metro leans on tells them to look for loners, drifters, broken men. Arthur hides inside the opposite, the idealized family fantasy Dexter has been chasing since Rita. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that double life. Because as Dexter infiltrates Arthur's world, school assemblies, family breakfasts, Habitat builds. Miami Metro keeps brushing right past it. They interview neighbors, but never him. They map locations, but not communities. They chase a shadow while the real man shakes their hands at public vigils. Each major section will show another investigation cracking under the same pressure, but Trinity is the purest version, even with Lundy's expertise, with federal resources, with a clear trajectory of kills. The department will spend an entire season orbiting Arthur Mitchell without ever truly seeing him. And when they finally collide with his reality, the consequences for Dexter, for Deb, and for Miami Metro's illusion of control will be irreversible. Lundy walks into that briefing room like a ghost from a better version of law enforcement. Years of chasing Trinity have carved the certainty into him, and when he lays out the pattern for Miami Metro, we can feel the gap between what he knows and what this department is capable of doing about it. To keep this clear, his presentation is brutally simple. 3 murders, 3 roles, 3 repeating stages. First, the young woman in a bathtub, wrists cut, staged as suicide. Then, the mother, forced off a ledge in a public fall that looks like despair. Finally, the father, beaten to death in some private, blue-collar corner of the city. Stalk the target. Recreate the trauma. Disappear. Lundy maps the geographic spread across decades, shows the way the killings jump states while keeping the same psychological code, and underlines the most chilling detail of all. This has been going on longer than most of them have even been cops. The room's reaction is a study in institutional ego. On the surface, there's respect. They know Lundy's reputation. They know he nearly cracked the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, and no one wants to look like the detective who rolls their eyes at a legend. But beneath the polite questions and careful nods, there's defensiveness. How did an outsider track a killer across the country, while Miami Metro failed to even notice Trinity passing through their own jurisdiction? What does it mean that a retired Fed sees a pattern they never even thought to look for? In this video, we're going to stay with that discomfort for a minute, because the focus is not just on how smart Lundy is, but on what the system literally cannot do with his insight. Jurisdictional boundaries slice Trinity's trajectory into separate, incomplete files. Each city logs 1 suicide, 1 fall, 1 domestic assault gone wrong. No one is funded to connect them. There's limited manpower, rotating task forces, and constant political pressure to chase the newest headline rather than an invisible thread stretching back 30 years. Then there's the relational failure. Deb brings Lundy in through a side door, emotionally and professionally. She's not just backing his theory, she's sleeping with him, defending him, staking her credibility on him. That makes it easy for colleagues to minimize his warnings as Deb's thing, rather than a structural alarm. Along the way, every joke about her love life, every sideways glance, chips away at how seriously his profile lands. And even with the pattern drawn on the board, the investigation stalls. Theory is neat. Groundwork is chaos. How do you hunt a ghost who kills 3 times in a city and then vanishes for years? Miami Metro has no plan for a predator whose control is defined by patience. They pull records, chase partial matches, brief patrol units, but it's all reactive. Each major section will show this same collapse, brilliant analysis that never fully translates into arrests, into prevention, into real safety. Here's the pattern interrupt. Miami Metro isn't just outsmarted by Trinity's mind. They're outmatched by his timeline. And the next time he steps into their city, that delay will cost them everything. And here's where it gets almost surreal. While Miami Metro scrambles behind Trinity's timetable, they keep brushing shoulders with the man himself. They're not just outmatched by his timeline. They're standing in the same rooms, shaking the same hands, and still never see the collapse coming. Picture the charity build, the school gym, the church fellowship hall. Arthur Mitchell in his work belt, surrounded by volunteers, kids, and pastors, giving humble speeches about service. These are the exact spaces Miami Metro canvasses, the communities they claim to protect. Yet, the investigation never seriously penetrates that world. To keep this clear, Trinity isn't hiding in some underground lair. He's at the fundraiser, at the grief group, at the pulpit. The central question is, why does no one in that department even imagine that this mild, soft-spoken grandfather could be the monster they're hunting? The answer is in their psychology. Miami Metro's mental image of a real killer looks like Dokes. Intense, volatile, visibly dangerous. So when they build their profile, it tilts toward the aggressive loner, the drifter. The blue-collar creep on the margins. A respected teacher who builds houses for the needy, he lives outside their threat model. We watch this bias play out in micro moments. Deb interviews neighbors and coworkers who literally describe Arthur's routines, his absences, his rituals, and the questions never go one step deeper. Background checks stop at a clean record and a church membership. They pull property records, but not donation lists. They map crime scenes, but never cross-reference charity projects that put Arthur in those exact neighborhoods. The focus is not just on what they miss, but on how systematically they choose not to look. And then there's Dexter, running his own parallel plan. While the task force chases a ghost, Dexter is having coffee with Arthur, infiltrating his family, tailing him across state lines. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this pattern. Dexter's private investigation actively blinds the public one. Every time he slips out of the station, blows off a briefing, or disappears mid-shift to stalk Trinity, Miami Metro loses another opportunity. Yet almost no one questions his sudden absences, his exhausted face, his obsession with routine blood work. How does a room full of detectives never flag the lab guy who always vanishes when bodies drop? Operationally, it's a cascade of failures. Underused victimology that never links the emotional resonance of Trinity's targets. Surface-level interviews that accept nice guy as an alibi. A task force that lets Dexter, the most compromised analyst in the building, frame their entire trajectory. And the consequences land on Rita. Trinity walks right through those cracks, right past the patrol cars and case boards, and kills the one person Miami Metro thinks is safely outside the blast radius. That bathtub is not just Dexter's existential failure, it's the department's too. Because if they can miss the monster next door once, who else is already in their orbit, smiling for a group photo, waiting for the next gap in their control? And the answer shows up almost immediately. Season 5 opens on the wreckage of Trinity, and instead of a humbled institution tightening its grip, we watch Miami Metro drift into one of its quietest, most damning failures. While they're still processing Rita's death, an entirely new horror moves through their jurisdiction, a traveling torture ring, a warehouse of barrels, and a single survivor who will do more to stop it than the entire department. Lumen Pierce doesn't arrive as a case file. She arrives as a screaming presence in one of Dexter's kill rooms. A woman pulled out of a plastic-wrapped nightmare he didn't create. Her psychology is raw, unfiltered trauma. No code, no procedure, just the need to confront the men who took everything from her. Dexter thinks he's found a controlled outlet, a project to reassert his plan after Trinity's collapse. Instead, he's about to help dismantle a network Miami Metro barely even registers exists. To keep this clear, look at what the police actually see. A dead Boyd Fowler, a few bodies in barrels, a vague trail pointing toward wealthy, well-connected men who always seem just out of reach. Every time Dexter and Lumen move, they're one step ahead of the official investigation, cleaning scenes, redirecting suspicion. erasing the connective tissue that would force the department to see a pattern. Miami Metro touches the case at the edges, then files it away as background noise. This is operational failure in slow motion. Fragmented investigations. Poor interagency cooperation. A federal task force that swoops in for optics more than insight. Each major section will get its own detective, its own board, its own press conference, but no one is empowered to say, what if these aren't isolated murders? What if this is infrastructure? The focus is not just on what they miss, but on how their structure almost guarantees that anything spread across jurisdictions and social classes will stay invisible. Meanwhile, the one person who does start connecting dots isn't chasing the barrel girls at all. He's chasing Dexter. Quinn notices the late nights, the sketchy connections to Trinity, the way Deb keeps defending her brother a little too fast. He hires Liddy, he starts an off-the-books investigation, he gets closer to the truth than any sanctioned task force. And then the relational angle kicks in. His feelings for Deb, his own dirty history, the politics of accusing a grieving colleague, all of it blunts his resolve. The central question becomes, protect the woman he loves, or pursue the man who might be a monster? Along the way, the show is brutally clear about the consequences. The worst men in this season, Jordan Chase and his inner circle, are not brought down by warrants or coordinated raids. They're stopped by a traumatized civilian and a serial killer working in the shadows of a police department that never truly understands what passed through its hands. That's not a triumph of vigilante justice. It's an existential indictment of the system, if this is what can operate in the blind spots. What happens when Dexter's control slips again, and there's no lumen left to drag the truth into the light? And the Barrel Girls case is where that indictment stops being abstract and turns into policy, press conferences, and body counts. From the moment those rusted drums surface in the swamp, we watch Miami Metro's investigation buckle under something more powerful than evidence or method. It buckles under optics. Plastic sheeting peeled back, dozens of women's bodies stacked like waste, helicopters circling overhead while reporters shout questions about negligence and failure. This isn't just a crime scene, it's a public relations crisis. City Hall is on the phone before the ME can finish a preliminary report. The central question, from the top down, silently shifts from who did this to how fast can we look like we have this under control. To keep this clear, watch how leadership behaves. LaGuerta and the brass don't design a long-haul trafficking investigation. They design a narrative. Identify a face. Announce a task force. Promise swift justice. Each major section will be staged for the cameras, a dramatic briefing, a person of interest, a suspect walk. The focus is not just on the network that captured, transported, and tortured these women, but on the single, camera-ready villain who can close the loop in a 30-second news package. That's how we get operational shortcuts masquerading as progress. A partial confession from one terrified accomplice becomes the spine of the case. A few names, a single location, one-night raid. Files get stamped closed as soon as a handful of perpetrators are in custody. Who recruited the girls? Who laundered the money? Who in law enforcement looked the other way? Those questions are dangerous because they don't fit the plan. They don't end in a podium moment. And the failures compound. Witnesses who could map the entire trafficking trajectory are treated as disposable assets instead of human beings in mortal danger. One informant is left exposed. Another is shuffled between interviews with minimal protection because the department assumes the real threat has already been neutralized. When those witnesses vanish or end up dead, the official line is tragic inevitability, not a collapse of basic investigative control. Meanwhile, off the books, Dexter and Lumen are doing the work Miami Metro keeps pretending it already did. They trace the operation's psychology, not just its headlines, the recordings, the ritualized torture, the buyers who never get their hands dirty. They don't stop at the guy who's easiest to arrest. They hunt the ones who planned the system, funded it, perfected it. While Miami Metro mops up the edges, they dismantle the core. In this video, we're going to keep seeing this pattern repeat. When the cameras are on, the department's need to look effective consistently overrides the need to be effective. And if this is how they handle an atrocity in plain sight, what happens when the next monster learns to weaponize that hunger for a quick win? Season 6 answers that question with a twisted kind of customer service. The next monster doesn't just anticipate Miami Metro's hunger for a quick win, he builds his entire plan around feeding it. Let's kick things off with the image the season can't stop returning to. Bodies posed like Renaissance paintings, horsemen assembled from body parts, victims turned into living dioramas of revelation. On paper, this should be Miami Metro's chance to shine. High profile, high symbolism, a clear pattern. In practice, the spectacle becomes the trap. Enter Professor James Geller and his supposed disciple, Travis Marshall. From the first tableau, the investigation frames them as a classic mastermind and follower pair. The charismatic, radical theology professor pulling the strings, the anxious, soft-spoken former student tagging along in guilty silence. It's neat. It's cinematic. It slots perfectly into every detective's favorite narrative about cult psychology and control. And that's exactly why it fails. The focus is not just on the crimes, but on how they're displayed. A murdered fruit vendor strung up like the angel of death in broad daylight. The Whore of Babylon, staged for the press. Each scene is placed where cameras can find it, where a crowd can gather, where the mayor's office will be on the phone in minutes. The investigation doesn't just respond, it performs. Press conferences, task force meetings, tight sound bites about stopping Geller before the final act. To keep this clear, the central question is not who is killing, but who is directing the story. Every time Batista and Quinn argue about leads, every time Deb is pushed to deliver a reassuring line to the media, we can feel the case drifting from analysis to optics. The department becomes reactive, chasing prophecy instead of evidence. Operationally, the collapse is almost embarrassing. Geller is treated as a living, breathing suspect long after the clues say otherwise. His abandoned church, his journal, the way no one has seen him outside Travis's retellings. Even the physical logistics of the murders point to a younger, more agile killer working alone. Yet the team keeps building flowcharts with Geller at the top, as if the structure of the diagram could will him into existence. Why? Because a lone, meek-seeming acolyte doesn't fit the story they've already committed to. Along the way, we watch seasoned detectives fall for one of the oldest cognitive traps in investigations, overvaluing the mythic leader, undervaluing the quiet operator. Travis's submissive posture, his apparent moral conflict, his boyish face, all of it functions as camouflage. They see a victim, not a planner. Pattern interrupt. Imagine, for a moment, that Miami Metro had inverted their assumptions. What if they'd treated Geller as dead evidence and Travis as the primary? The rooftop never happens. The Wormwood gas attack never comes close. But that's not this season's trajectory. Instead, we end on that rooftop showdown. Helicopters circling, officers scrambling up stairwells, only to arrive after Dexter has already ended Travis's revelation. Once again, the real resolution happens off-book, outside the code of law, while Miami Metro secures the perimeter of a story they never truly understood. And that's the real punchline of Season 6. While helicopters carve circles over Travis's final tableau, Miami Metro has spent weeks chasing a man who in any competent investigation would already be on a slab. The Doomsday Killer case isn't just a near miss, it's a full-scale hallucination the department willingly buys into. Let's kick things off with the image that the season keeps repeating. Travis in dim rooms, whispering with Professor Geller, taking orders, arguing theology. On first watch, we accept the premise. Two killers, a twisted mentor and an unstable disciple. But on rewatch, the seams are obvious. Geller never touches anything. Travis does all the physical work. In the church, he drags bodies, moves props, loads victims onto makeshift altars while Geller stands back, framed like a painting rather than a participant. Watch the diner scene where Travis meets Geller in public. Plates clatter, waitresses weave between tables, and yet no one glances at the supposedly infamous missing professor. Travis talks to an empty chair. The camera cuts around it, preserving the illusion, but the psychology is clear. This is a one-sided argument, projected into thin air. Miami Metro has access to the same pattern of behavior we do. They just never question the premise. To keep this clear, the operational failures are basic. No verified recent sightings of Geller by anyone outside Travis's narrative. No security footage. No neighbors. No colleagues. Nothing. His bank accounts sit frozen. No withdrawals. No credit card activity. No travel. At one point, Batista and Quinn poke around the university, but the follow-through collapses into office gossip and bar flirting instead of a serious manhunt for a supposedly active serial mastermind. The central question almost no one in the squad asks is brutally simple. Is Professor Geller actually alive? They accept the evil professor trope because it fits a familiar story. Charismatic cult leader. Brainwashed follower. It's neat. It's cinematic. It lets them imagine a single, controlling intellect behind the tableau instead of confronting the messier reality of a lone, fragmented killer unraveling in real time. The focus is not just on what they miss, but on how Dexter, operating outside their official investigation, quietly dismantles the illusion. He notices the dust patterns in Geller's office, the untouched personal items, the way every crime scene points back to Travis's physical presence, not a partnership. While the task force debates profiles and press conferences, Dexter breaks into the abandoned church and finds the truth: Geller's corpse, hidden in a freezer, long dead. The mastermind is literally on ice. In that moment, the existential failure snaps into focus. Miami Metro is chasing a ghost. Their plan, their control, their entire investigation is oriented around stopping a man who cannot act, cannot choose, cannot be arrested. Meanwhile, the real killer, the living threat, walks through their halls, gives statements, even receives their protection. And if the department can be fooled this completely by one dead man's shadow, what does that say about every other monster moving through their blind spots? And that question lands us right in the middle of Season 7. When the past Miami Metro thought it buried, claws its way back through a single, glinting piece of glass. Lagerta bends down at a fresh crime scene. New body, new nightmare, same old pattern, plastic, precision, ritual. Then she sees it. A tiny blood slide tucked away like a calling card. Concrete image, massive implication. Because for her, that slide doesn't just mean a meticulous killer. It detonates a memory. The Bay Harbor butcher evidence they all agreed to lock in a box and never really look at again. To keep this clear, Laguerta's awakening doesn't start with a theory. It starts with an object that contradicts the official story. Dokes is dead. The butcher case is closed. The slides were supposed to end with him. So how is one sitting here, years later, at a crime scene Dokes could not have touched? Suddenly the clean narrative of a rogue cop implodes and a different possibility creeps in. What if the real butcher never stopped? She doesn't call a press conference. She doesn't even call a task force. Instead, She quietly reopens the investigation in the only way she can, alone, in archives, in shadows. Old boxes of files, photos of weighted bags pulled from the ocean, Dexter's blood spatter, reports lining up a little too neatly with the way the bodies vanished. The focus is not just on the evidence itself, but on how perfectly it once confirmed what they wanted to believe. We watch her reread her own signatures, her own approvals, and you can feel the psychology shift. The central question is no longer was Dokes dangerous, but were we desperate for him to be guilty? That's operational courage on a different scale. For the first time, someone in leadership is willing to consider that Miami Metro's proudest win might actually be its most catastrophic failure. And that courage has a cost. Along the way, her renewed suspicion puts her directly at odds with the people who have built their emotional recovery on the Dokes story. Batista, who lost a friend and needs that loss to be meaningful. Deb, now lieutenant, clinging to institutional control while secretly managing Dexter's chaos. Every step Lagerda takes back into the Bay Harbor Butcher files threatens not just a closed case, but the fragile trajectories of everyone who survived it. This is where the relational tension spikes. We can see Deb flinch when Lagerda asks the wrong question. We can see Batista bristle when the investigation brushes against his memories. They're not just defending a narrative for the department. They're defending the version of reality that lets them function. But beneath that, something darker is happening. LaGuerta believes she's finally seeing clearly, stripping away the myth of closure to expose the living killer who played them all. In truth, she's walking straight into a plan already in motion. A trap engineered by the very monster she's circling. The investigation she thinks will redeem Miami Metro is the one that will prove, in the harshest possible way, how little control they ever had. And once Lagerda steps over that line, there's no going back. For her, for Deb, or for Dexter's collapsing illusion that he can manage every threat that gets too close. LaGuerta doesn't just cross that line emotionally, she crosses it procedurally. From this point on, every quiet step she takes is a direct challenge to Miami Metro's proudest narrative: we caught the Bay Harbor Butcher. We closed the case. We won. But let's kick things off with the way she rebuilds that old investigation from the ground up. She goes back to the cabin where Dokes died, not as a memorial, but as a crime scene that never made sense. Burn patterns, blast radius, the logistics of one man supposedly holding a notorious killer at gunpoint while also being the killer himself. It doesn't add up, and she lets that discomfort sit. Then she retraces Dokes' movements, digging into travel records, stakeouts, surveillance logs. Everywhere she looks, the same pattern appears. Dokes is chasing something real, and Dexter is always in the periphery. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on what she finds, but on how everyone else reacts. Lagerda asks simple questions about the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force. Why did we stop looking once Dokes died? Why did we rely so heavily on Dexter's blood work to confirm our own theory? The room freezes. Colleagues who once respected her now hear an accusation against a dead partner. They frame it as disrespect, as if questioning the case file is the same as dragging Dokes' name through the mud. The backlash is personal, but it's also political. We watch Batista, Quinn, and the brass interpret her persistence as ambition, not conscience. The psychology is brutal. It's easier to believe Lagerta is maneuvering for power than to believe the department built its reputation on a catastrophic failure. Internal reviews get lost. Requests for resources stall. Meetings are postponed indefinitely. She's not just chasing a killer. She's pushing against an institution that has decided the truth is a threat to its own survival. And inside that institution, Deb becomes the saboteur. In this video, we're going to keep returning to the way relationships become tools of control, and here Deb weaponizes hers. She uses her rank to redirect manpower to bury LaGuerta's leads under more urgent cases. To slow walk warrants and quietly discredit LaGuerta's instincts in hallway conversations. When LaGuerta asks about Dexter's proximity to multiple suspicious scenes, Deb has an answer ready. A plausible explanation. A reason to move on. The central question LaGuerta is really asking is devastating. If Dexter is the Bay Harbor butcher, what does that make us? Every step closer she gets, the existential stakes sharpen. Because if she's right, then Miami Metro's greatest triumph is actually its greatest collapse. A serial killer hiding in plain sight while the entire department leaned on his analysis, his code, his supposed control. Along the way, almost no one wants to face that. It's safer to protect the story than reopen the wound. Which is why, when LaGuerta finally forces the truth into the open, the next phase isn't about solving a case at all. It's about who the department is willing to sacrifice to keep their illusion intact. So when we arrive at that New Year's Eve shipping yard, we're not just watching a trap for Dexter. We're watching Miami Metro's last real shot at honesty load itself into a gun. LaGuerta has done the math. The Bay Harbor butcher investigation, the boat records, the gas receipts, the church fire, the psychology of a killer who keeps orbiting the department. To keep this clear, she doesn't call a task force, doesn't loop in internal affairs. She does what Dexter has done for years. She goes off the books. She pulls Deb in with a GPS trick, stages the scene, and believes this will be the moment everything snaps into focus and the illusion finally dies. It's operational irony in its purest form. The cop who always preached procedure suddenly adopts the vigilante playbook. No backup, no cameras, no chain of command, just instinct, conviction, and a single high-risk plan to force Dexter and Deb into the light. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to these reversals, because the focus is not just on Dexter's kills, but on how everyone around him eventually imitates his methods right before they collapse. And then we hit the real center of gravity. Deb's choice. LaGuerta on the ground, begging her to see what's right in front of her. Dexter telling her there's no way out unless LaGuerta dies. Two people, two versions of the truth, and one cop who has already broken every rule to protect her brother. What does control even mean in that moment? Deb can arrest Dexter. She can shoot Dexter, or she can do the one thing that will keep Miami Metro intact while destroying any chance it has to be honest. She shoots LaGuerta. That single gunshot seals the department's trajectory. The one person willing to pull the thread on the Bay Harbor butcher, to question the blood-spatter golden boy, to reopen the wound everyone else agreed to forget. Erased, officially, it's a tragic casualty in a messy confrontation. Unofficially, it's a murder of accountability. Miami Metro will never write the report that says how close they came. They will never log the evidence that almost broke the case. They will never admit that their greatest failure happened in a place they never even thought to surveil. From the outside, the season moves on. New cases, new bodies, new promotions. Inside the story, though, this is the existential failure. The institution decides, through Deb's finger on the trigger, that it would rather live with a lie than confront the consequences of the truth. And the darkest part? No one at Miami Metro ever knows that their most important case ended in a shipping yard they never responded to, with a body they were never allowed to see for what it really was. Because the central question from here on isn't just who Dexter kills, It's how far the entire system will go to make sure no one ever asks what really happened that night. From an invisible shipping yard, we move to something even more unnerving. A killer who walks in through the front door disguised as help. Season 8 doesn't just give us another big bad. It gives us Dr. Evelyn Vogel, a neuropsychiatrist who treats Miami Metro like a lab she already owns. She appears out of nowhere with a file cabinet in her head. She knows Harry. She knows the code. She knows Dexter in ways Dexter himself hasn't articulated. And she does it all with this calm, clinical certainty that immediately reorders the room. To keep this clear, Vogel isn't introduced as a suspect or a wild card. She's introduced as an authority, the psychopath whisperer who can decode the brain surgeon before anyone else can even define him. So when the brain surgeon case explodes with those surgically removed pieces of brain, Miami Metro does what it always does when the investigation feels too big. It reaches for an expert, and Vogel is right there, already framed as the answer. She walks the squad through the killer's psychology, explains the trophies, shapes the profile. Within days, her narrative becomes the investigation's spine. How many people in that room actually check her background? How many ask why this stranger has such intimate access to their history? The operational failure is almost mundane in its simplicity. They accept her credentials at face value. They accept her story about Harry and Dexter without demanding corroborating records, independent evaluations, or even a second opinion. The same department that once built a task force around the Bay Harbor butcher now lets a single outside voice define the parameters of a new serial killer hunt. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that pattern. Whenever the case is most dangerous, Miami Metro is most willing to outsource control. And inside that outsourced control, another fracture opens. Dexter already knows Vogel, or rather, Vogel already knows Dexter. Their secret sessions, her claim that she helped design the code, the way she frames his entire life as a successful experiment in channeling violence. All of that creates a massive conflict of interest, sitting at the center of an active investigation. But because Dexter is their trusted blood guy, and she is the trusted brain expert, no one even thinks to ask what happens when those two stories overlap. The focus is not just on Miami Metro being gullible, it's on how easily the entire system can be folded into a private drama it doesn't see. The brain surgeon isn't just a random predator. He's tied to Vogel's past. He's orbiting Dexter's present. And yet the official manhunt proceeds as if this is a clean, objective search for an unknown offender. Here's the pattern interrupt. By the time Miami Metro starts chasing the brain surgeon, they're already living inside his origin story, narrated by the woman who helped create him. Each major section will show this more clearly, but Season 8 makes it explicit. The investigation is not just failing to catch up, it's being steered, scene by scene, by people with their own scripts. So when we ask the central question going forward, who is really in control of these cases, Vogel forces a darker possibility. Maybe Miami Metro isn't just missing the truth. Maybe it's being handed a manufactured version of reality that keeps the real consequences just out of reach. So when we say the investigation is being handed a manufactured reality, the brain surgeon case is where that really crystallizes. From the first tableau, we are watching a killer who is not just taunting Miami Metro, but actively writing their script for them. Let's kick things off with those early crime scenes. Bodies with precise sections of brain tissue removed. Surgical cuts, not rage wounds. Messages left that feel half medical report, half performance art. From a brain segment placed on a family photo to the way the incisions avoid obvious trace evidence, the killer is broadcasting two things at once: an intimate knowledge of neurology and a working grasp of forensic procedure. This is not random brutality. This is someone designing the investigation as carefully as the murder. To keep this clear, Miami Metro does recognize the surface pattern. They see medical expertise. They see a taunting signature. They build profiles around surgeons, hospital staff, former patients with grudges. On paper, that looks like control, a logical plan. But the focus is not just on who could wield a scalpel. It should be on who is close enough to the case to anticipate every investigative move. And that's where the failure begins. Because while Vogel is consulting, shaping the psychological profile, feeding them language about psychopaths and the original code, nobody in the room turns that lens back on her. They cycle through suspects with textbook efficiency, ex-patients who blame her, colleagues who dislike her methods, institutional enemies who might want to discredit her, without ever fully interrogating Vogel's own history of creating monsters. How many of these people intersect because of her? How many old case files point back to the same quiet architect? Operationally, the gaps are glaring. Limited cross-referencing of historic homicides that match this surgical precision. Minimal digging into the psychiatric institutions and research programs that tie the victims together. They treat each scene as a fresh horror instead of asking the central question, what long-term experiment are we walking into? A room full of detectives, and almost no one is tasked with mapping the decades-long trajectory of Vogel's work. Meanwhile, Dexter is running a parallel track. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this pattern. His off-book investigation both compensates for and corrupts the official one. He spots behavioral tells faster. He connects victims through Vogel's private files. He closes in on the real brain surgeon with a clarity Miami Metro never achieves. But every time he withholds evidence, stages confrontations alone, or eliminates suspects without explanation, he pushes the department further away from the core truth they supposedly serve. So the case resolves, but not because of clean police work. It resolves through vigilante pressure, personal vendettas, and a code that was never designed for transparency. Miami Metro gets a narrative they can file, not an understanding of what actually happened. And that gap between the story they close and the reality they missed sets the stage for the next collapse, when a far older pattern of killings forces them to confront just how many ghosts have been hiding in their own archives. If the old cases are ghosts in the archives, Hannah McKay is the one specter Miami Metro actually touches and still lets drift straight through their fingers. A living, breathing reminder that even when the killer is right in front of them, their plan for control can collapse on contact with real human entanglement. Let's kick things off with who Hannah is when she re-enters Miami's orbit. Not a blank slate. A notorious former accomplice in a teenage killing spree, the girl who supposedly turned state's witness did her time and reinvented herself as a celebrity gardener in season 7. On paper, she's a cautionary tale about trauma and reform. In practice, she's a textbook case study in how a charming psychopath can read an investigation better than the investigators. From the moment Wayne Randall starts talking, Deb sees the opening. Here's a chance to revisit an old spree. Test Hannah's story. Maybe close a few bodies that never got justice. She pushes for interviews, subpoenas, a real interrogation. But institutional support, that wavers fast. No airtight physical evidence, no political appetite to dig up a headline making case everyone already resolved. The central question for the brass isn't truth, it's risk management. Why destabilize the narrative when the files already say cooperation and closure? So Miami Metro leans on what they do have, Dexter. His blood work, his testimony, his supposed objectivity. To keep this clear, the entire Hannah McKay operation is structurally flawed from the jump, because The key witness and analyst is also the man falling in love with her. They don't know that yet, but we do, and Hannah does. She adjusts her psychology, her demeanor, even her vulnerability to fit exactly what Dexter's looking for. Operationally, the failures pile up. The poison evidence is mishandled and delayed. They rely on Dexter's contested account of an earlier murder, and when they finally move to secure Hannah, they do it with a single. Rushed hospital arrest rather than building an unshakable case. One tainted cup, one allegation, one hurried confession. How fragile can an investigation be and still call itself a win? The focus is not just on the procedural mistakes, though. It's on the relational blind spot. Dexter's involvement with Hannah is a screaming conflict of interest that Miami Metro never truly uncovers or addresses. Deb suspects something, circles it, confronts Dexter privately, but the institution never formalizes that suspicion into policy, oversight, or a reassignment. Along the way, the department treats Dexter as an incorruptible instrument of the code, not a man whose personal trajectory is warping every decision he makes. So Hannah walks. She beats the charges, disappears, and later resurfaces in Dexter's life without Miami Metro ever realizing how close they came to having another serial killer in custody. No internal review. No systemic lesson learned. Just another closed file that isn't actually closed, setting us up for the next, even uglier question. What happens when the killer they miss doesn't just escape, but starts killing inside the department itself? So when we finally reach the storm, it isn't just a weather event rolling toward Miami. It's every missed pattern, every failed investigation, every blind spot we've been tracking, gathering into one last, literal whiteout. Sirens wail, patients are being evacuated, generators hum in the background, and Dexter moves through the hospital like a ghost with a badge. He's there. He's armed. He's making the most consequential plan of his life. And almost no one in Miami Metro even registers it. We watch him wheel Deb through chaotic hallways, slip in and out of restricted areas, make choices that rewrite the trajectory of both their lives. Nurses rush past. Officers shout into radios. Helicopters thrum overhead. In this video, we're going to treat that entire sequence as a case study in institutional tunnel vision. The department is physically present in the same crisis, but psychologically absent from what Dexter is actually doing. The focus is not just on his personal collapse, but on how thoroughly he's learned to operate in the blind zones they've given him. Then comes the vanishing act. A boat, a body on a stretcher, a hurricane swallowing the horizon. No witnesses. No black box. No remains. And somehow, this is accepted as plausible closure. In any other context, a high-value forensic asset disappearing at sea in the middle of a catastrophe, right after a suspicious hospital incident, would trigger a full internal investigation. Where are the interviews, the timeline reconstructions, the hard questions about why Dexter removed Deb from care? They never really happen. To keep this clear, we're not talking about a random patrol officer lost in the storm. We're talking about the Bay Harbor Butcher's former prime analyst, the man who has stood at the epicenter of almost every major serial case the department has ever touched. The central question practically screams from the file: how does that man die off-screen, with no body and no serious skepticism? The answer is brutal in its simplicity. They're exhausted. Deb is gone. LaGuerta is gone. Dokes, Rita, Lundy, all ghosts in the building. Years of unresolved trauma, public humiliation, and political pressure have left Miami Metro emotionally numb. They need a story that feels clean. Dexter, the dedicated blood-spatter guy who couldn't live without his sister, sails into the storm and never comes back. Tragic, neat, closed. The psychology here isn't subtle. It's defensive. Questioning the narrative, means reopening every failure that led to this moment. And that's why this isn't just an operational failure. It's the existential failure. Along the way, we've seen killers exploit the department's procedures, its politics, its personal relationships. But this is different. This is the serial killer in their lab, simply walking off stage while the curtain falls, and everyone applauds the ending as if it makes sense. No code review, no systemic reckoning, just a file stamped, deceased, and buried. Pattern interrupt. What if Dexter had actually died there? Would Miami Metro be any less outsmarted? The uncomfortable truth is that his disappearance, real or staged, lands the same way because the institution never learns. Which sets us up for the final, ugliest twist. When the storm passes and Dexter resurfaces in Iron Lake, the consequences of that blind acceptance don't stay in Miami. They follow his son. We cut from the hurricane-smashed skyline of Miami to snowdrifting over Iron Lake, New York. Different weather, different jurisdiction, different name. On paper, Dexter Morgan is gone, and Jim Lindsay is just a quiet guy at the local shop. He runs, he dates, he pretends the past is sealed. The plan is simple. Stay small. Stay invisible. Stay in control. But the central question hangs over every frame of New Blood. Did Dexter actually escape? Or did Miami Metro's failures just migrate north with him? In this video, we're going to treat Iron Lake not as a fresh start, but as the next phase of the same investigation that never really ended. The focus is not just on Dexter's new life, but on how the ghosts of old cases slip through firewalls and decades to find him again. To keep this clear, we start with Angela Bishop, a small-town police chief working with a tiny staff, a glitchy record system, and a wall of missing women whose faces no one in Miami ever had to look at. Her investigation doesn't begin with the Bay Harbor butcher. It begins with local disappearances, with inconsistencies in travel records, with a girlfriend who never quite fits his own backstory. It's relational before it's procedural. And yet, as she digs, the worlds fuse. A simple database search, a borrowed login, a late-night scroll through old federal and Miami Metro files. Suddenly, the Bay Harbor butcher is back, not as a breaking case, but as a badly resolved chapter gathering digital dust. Angela does what no one at Miami Metro ever did consistently. She follows the pattern without flinching at what it implies. A butcher whose victims match Dexter's psychology. A supposed resolution that pins everything on a dead cop. A narrative that feels a little too convenient. There's a brutal operational irony here. Miami had full task forces, press conferences, interagency cooperation, and a blood spatter analyst literally building the case from the inside. Iron Lake has one overworked chief, a printer that jams, and a stack of missing person flyers. Yet Angela is the one who asks the questions Miami Metro never fully dared to pursue. What if the Bay Harbor butcher profile doesn't fit Dokes? What if the evidence points back toward the lab? What if the hero cop mythology around that case is itself a failure of investigation? Dexter's old life survives as PDFs, scanned reports, and half-complete case notes. Each major section will show how those legacy files become landmines. The mishandled Bay Harbor butcher investigation. The misattributed bodies. The institutional need to close the case. All of it turns into a searchable archive Angela can reinterpret with fresh eyes and fewer loyalties. Miami Metro thought the story was over. Angela treats it as a cold case that never got solved correctly. And when she reaches out, Miami Metro doesn't return as a sharp, active task force. They come back as custodians of a flawed archive, voices on the phone defending a conclusion we already know is wrong. Which raises the next problem. What happens when that archive collides with Harrison? So when those files collide with Harrison, they don't just fill in a few blanks for Angela, they blow open a whole alternate history of Dexter Morgan. One Google search for Bay Harbor Butcher Miami Metro becomes the doorway Miami never walked through, and we watch her do, from a quiet house in Iron Lake, what an entire task force failed to do under fluorescent lights and press conferences. Let's kick things off with the moment of doubt. Angela reads the official story, decorated Sergeant Doak's secret monster, case closed. On paper, it's neat. Too neat. The central question forms almost immediately. How does a supposedly meticulous predator leave such a perfect narrative gift wrapped for internal affairs? From a laptop screen, Angela can see what Miami Metro, buried in its own politics and fear, refused to interrogate. To keep this clear, we need to track her process as an investigation, not a hunch. She cross-references missing person reports from that era with the Bay Harbor timeline, noticing how many violent offenders simply vanish around Dexter's years in Miami. She clocks the coincidence of Dexter's death in the storm and the abrupt end of a pattern of bodies carved with surgical precision. Then she lays that next to the mythology Miami sold about Doakes: impulsive, explosive, sloppy. How does a man like that suddenly become a ghost who never leaves a trace? What makes this such an operational embarrassment is the scale mismatch. Miami Metro had war rooms, whiteboards, interagency briefings. Angela has a browser, a printer, and the stubborn psychology of a cop who actually wants the pattern to make sense. With a few late-night searches, she reconstructs the same arc we watched across Season 2. The code, the boat dumps, the bloodslide ritual. Only this time, the plan to hide behind procedure collapses because the person reading the files isn't invested in protecting the legend of Dexter Morgan. And that's the twist that really stings. Angela loves Jim Lindsay. She trusts him with her daughter, her bed, her future. Her position mirrors Miami Metro's trust in their bloodspatter guy, the quiet expert who always has answers. But when those answers start to contradict the record, she does what they never did. She chooses truth over loyalty. What happens to Dexter's illusion of control when the person he sleeps next to starts seeing what his entire department missed? The focus is not just on her cleverness, it's on Miami Metro's existential failure. Their greatest shame, the Bay Harbor Butcher, is not finally exposed by internal reform or some heroic colleague putting the pieces together. It's exposed by an outsider, hundreds of miles away, scrolling through their archived collapse and finding the seams. Along the way, we realize something even darker. If Angela can do this with public records, what else was always visible? Because once she connects Bay Harbor to Harrison's dark urges, the investigation stops being historical. It becomes live. And that's where Miami's old ghosts start breathing inside Iron Lake. Because once she connects Bay Harbor to Harrison's dark urges, the investigation stops being historical. It becomes live. And that's where Miami's old ghosts start breathing inside Iron Lake. Let's kick things off with the image the entire franchise keeps circling back to: a baby sitting in a pool of blood. First, it's Dexter in a shipping container. Then, it's Harrison in Rita's bathroom, Trinity's final message written in his mother's body. Harrison isn't just Dexter's son. He's the physical record of Miami Metro's failure to protect the family of the man they trusted to read blood for them, the stain they never clean up. To keep this clear, Harrison grows up as a story before he ever walks into Iron Lake High. Your mother died. We had to leave Miami. Your father was taken by a storm. Every sentence is a partial cover-up, a narrative control plan designed by adults who are already drowning in their own lies. So when Harrison talks about dark thoughts, about wanting to hurt people who hurt others, what is he actually inheriting? Genetics? or a mythology carefully edited by people who never told him what really happened in that bathroom? The central question becomes psychological as much as investigative: who's raising Harrison, and who's responsible for the damage? After Rita's death, no one at Miami Metro truly reckons with his existence. Deb is shattered. Dexter is dissociating. The department moves on to the next case, the next press conference, the next manhunt. No follow-up. No welfare checks. No scenes of Batista or Masuka asking, "What about the baby?" It's a relational failure disguised as procedural momentum. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between case files and consequences. On paper, Trinity is closed. Bay Harbor is closed. The ice truck killer is closed. But Harrison is what those closed investigations look like in human form. He's the unresolved trauma that never makes it into the report, walking and talking and trying to build a personality around missing data. When Harrison arrives in Iron Lake, he doesn't just find Dexter. He reboots the entire Miami trajectory. Secrets return. Lies multiply. Vigilante fantasies start to feel like a viable outlet again. The bullying incident at school, the straight razor, the staged heroism at the wrestling match, these aren't random teenage outbursts. They echo the same pattern we've seen for 8 seasons. Violence framed as protection. Control justified by trauma. A code improvised after the fact to explain what he already wanted to do. Pattern interrupt. What if Harrison is actually the better detective? He senses Dexter's lies before Angela does. He reads inconsistencies in his father's story, the way Dexter once read blood spatter. But instead of an institution to channel that perception, he has a fugitive father and a trail of half-truths. The focus is not just on how Miami Metro missed killers. It's on how their collapse ensures the next generation lives inside the fallout. Harrison proves that when institutions fail at the operational level, the damage reappears as psychology, as identity, as a boy who can't tell where his own impulses end and his father's legend begins. No task force can close that kind of case. And as we move into the final stretch, we have to ask, once Harrison starts seeing the full picture, what happens to Dexter's last illusion of control? By the time Harrison starts piecing together who his father really is, we've already watched another institution fail just as completely. Miami Metro doesn't just miss Dexter. It builds an entire operational culture that practically invites people like him in. To keep this clear, we can trace it through a few signature collapses. They let Dexter run point on his own case as the Bay Harbor butcher, trusting his blood spatter readings to guide an investigation into a killer who disposes of bodies exactly the way Dexter does. That isn't a clever ruse he barely pulls off. It's a structural failure, no conflict of interest checks, no independent review, no one asking the most basic question: why is the guy interpreting the evidence the only one who always looks clean? We see the same pattern in the Hannah McKay investigation. Evidence goes missing, witnesses change their stories, and somehow the department treats it like bad luck rather than a flashing red light that someone inside the process is being handled. Dexter tampers with blood work and poisoning reports, and the system's response is not to tighten its procedures, but to shrug and move on to the next case. Plan, collapse, reset, no learning curve. And then there's Geller, an entire season where a supposed mastermind is operating in Miami, and no one at Miami Metro bothers to rigorously verify whether he's even alive. They chase a ghost on the basis of old photos and student testimony, while the real killer, Travis, walks among them. That's not just a mislead. That's an investigation built on untested assumptions, where paperwork replaces proof. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to those structural cracks, overworked detectives triaging cases, political interference pushing quick arrests, and a culture obsessed with clearance rates over rigor. The focus is not just on who they fail to catch, but on how the department's own psychology, its need to feel in control, drives it to close files rather than confront uncertainty. Killers learn to read that. Brian tailors his scenes to Dexter, knowing Miami Metro will chase the generic profile, while Dexter gets the real message. Trinity uses jurisdictional fragmentation, killing in different counties and states so that no single task force can see his full trajectory. The Barrel Girl ring hides in bureaucratic cracks, exploiting missing person reports, interagency miscommunication, and the assumption that sex workers are disposable data points. Each major section will show how one failure compounds the next. A bad habit becomes standard practice. A shortcut becomes policy. The Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force's blind trust in Dexter normalizes internal conflicts of interest. The mishandled Hannah evidence teaches everyone that contamination is survivable. The Geller debacle reinforces tunnel vision. Once a narrative is set, no one wants to be the one to break it. At what point does this stop being about individual detectives having a bad day and become a design flaw in the system itself? And if the system is bent that far, what happens when someone like Dexter decides to push it just a little further? When we look at how the system is bent, we can't ignore what's doing most of the bending: relationships. In a building full of homicide detectives, the most powerful force isn't evidence or procedure. It's love, loyalty, and the need to believe we know the people standing next to us. Let's kick things off with the most intimate failure: Deb and Brian. Deb isn't just dating a charming guy who turns out to be a serial killer. She's sleeping with the ice truck killer while he's designing an investigation around her brother. The psychology of that relationship doesn't just blind her. It blinds the entire squad. Her eagerness to vouch for Brian softens scrutiny, reframes red flags as coincidences, and turns what should have been a careful background check into a rubber stamp. When the truth hits, it's not just a personal betrayal. It's proof that Miami Metro's trust can be weaponized. The same pattern mutates with LaGuerta and Miguel. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to Miguel because he's not just a killer. He's a politician in a suit. LaGuerta's romance with him fuses office politics with emotional bias. Promotions are on the line, reputations are at stake, and suddenly the plan is not follow the evidence, but protect the golden boy Ada, who makes us look good. Leads that might implicate Miguel get softened, redirected, or quietly dropped, because accusing him would mean admitting the entire prosecution machine backed the wrong man. The central question stops being who did this and becomes how do we not embarrass ourselves? To keep this clear, the focus is not just on romantic ties, it's the familial trust wrapped around Dexter. He's the reliable blood guy, the coffee-fetching lab rat everyone jokes with in the bullpen. That familiarity becomes armor. The Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force literally relies on Dexter's analysis to hunt Dexter, and no one wants to be the one to say, what if the conflict of interest is the point? Defending colleagues like Dokes and Dexter becomes more important than following uncomfortable evidence that points inside the house. Dokes gets sacrificed because he's abrasive and isolated. Dexter gets protected because he's likable and embedded. Along the way, loyalty turns into a weapon against accountability. When LaGuerta finally starts pulling on the Bay Harbor thread again, she's not treated as a diligent investigator. She's framed as a traitor attacking her own. Her Trinity suspicions, her quiet re-examination of old cases, all get filtered through the lens of, is she out to get Dexter? Rather than, is she right? In a culture where calling out a colleague equals betrayal, whistleblowers don't just lose traction, they lose safety. And this is where the collapse becomes systemic. In a world of serial killers, the most dangerous thing Miami Metro does is assume They already know who is and isn't capable of monstrosity. Once that assumption hardens, every investigation that challenges it feels like a personal attack. What happens when the next killer understands that and walks straight through the front door? They don't just walk through the front door. They move in, learn everyone's blind spots, and then let Miami Metro write them into a comforting story. That's the real horror underneath all the investigative failures we've been tracking. The illusion that the people in charge of the narrative are also in control of reality. To keep this clear, think about 3 anchor points in the show's trajectory. Trinity's decades-long run, the Bay Harbor Butcher cover story, and Dexter's quiet disappearance after Deb's death. 3 different eras, 3 different investigations, all ending with Miami Metro congratulating itself while the truth slips out of frame. Trinity is officially closed as Arthur Mitchell, the lone monster. The Butcher is closed as James Dokes, the rogue cop. Dexter Morgan is closed as a tragic loss in the chaos of that final storm. Case closed. Press conferences. Neat files. But underneath those neat files, the failures line up. Trinity operated for 30 years, across multiple jurisdictions, while a major homicide unit obsessed over him for 1 season of their lives. The Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force literally relied on Dexter's analysis to hunt Dexter, never once treating the conflict of interest as anything more than an awkward coincidence. When Dexter vanishes, there is no serious internal investigation, no systemic reckoning, just grief and a quiet pivot back to business, as usual. The focus is not just on what they miss in the field, but on what they refuse to see about themselves. Because Miami Metro clings to a specific psychology of control, they imagine themselves as the thin blue line between order and chaos, even as chaos repeatedly originates from inside their own walls. Brian Moser walks their halls as a prosthetics vendor. Miguel Prado uses his political capital to steer investigations and bury inconvenient leads. Dexter stands in the middle of the squad room, the literal embodiment of the Bay Harbor Butcher, and gets praised for his work ethic. How do you defend the city from monsters when the badge, the lab coat, and the task force board keep getting weaponized by those monsters? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that psychological need for closure. Miami needs clean endings, a named suspect, a press conference, a narrative that calms the public and reassures the officers that their plan is working. That need turns doubt into a threat. So they arrest the convenient suspect. They accept confessions that arrive at just the right political moment. They treat every solved case as proof that the system works, instead of asking whether the system is simply good at producing stories that feel like justice. Then, new blood arrives and quietly detonates all of that. We discover that Dexter didn't die a noble death. He ran. He built a new identity, a new code, a new set of lies, and Miami Metro never uncovered any of it. Batista's late series realization that the Bay Harbor Butcher might still be alive doesn't just incriminate Dexter. It retroactively exposes Miami's entire narrative as incomplete at best, delusional at worst. If the department's greatest victory was built on a false confession and a misread body, what else have they been wrong about? And that's the central question hanging over every failure. Was Miami Metro ever truly in control, or were they just narrating whatever made their losses bearable? If the myth of control is this fragile, what happens the next time a killer decides to write themselves into the story as the hero? If Miami Metro's myth of control is this fragile, we have to ask a darker question. What happens when the institution doesn't just miss the monster, but trains it? Not by accident, by design. Harry is the hinge point, a veteran cop who has stared into enough crime scenes to understand exactly how an investigation breathes, where it stalls, and which blind spots everyone silently agrees to ignore. When he writes the code, He isn't drafting a moral manifesto. He's building a stealth protocol calibrated to the rhythms of police work. No witnesses, no bodies left in public. Targets who already live in the gray areas of under-resourced cases. It's not ethics, it's counter-forensics. To keep this clear, Harry's rules map almost perfectly onto what he knows his colleagues will never question. Dexter doesn't just kill criminals, he kills the ones the system has already failed, cases Miami Metro has logged, filed, and emotionally moved past. The paperwork says closed or dead end, so the psychology of the squad follows. Nobody goes back. Nobody reopens the wound. Harry's code nests inside that complacency, like malware inside trusted software. And then there's the training. Harry doesn't push Dexter toward therapy or distance from crime scenes. He teaches him blood, trajectory, cast off, void patterns, the exact language detectives rely on to anchor their sense of objectivity. That's not a coincidence. That's a plan. By the time we meet Dexter in Season 1, he's not just a killer with a hobby. He's the lab guy everyone needs. When the Bay Harbor butcher case explodes, the task force literally uses Dexter's own blood spatter analysis to chase Dexter. Conflict of interest? On paper, yes. In practice, the institutional reflex is simple: we trust our own. And Harry knows that reflex will hold. He cultivates it. He walks Dexter through crime scenes as a teenager. He vouches for him. He embeds his son inside the very department that should be his natural predator. The focus is not just on a father protecting a child. It's on a cop weaponizing institutional loyalty as a permanent shield. Here's the irony that borders on horror. The same culture that closes ranks, that treats Harry as a legend and his progs as untouchable, is the culture that incubates a predator perfectly adapted to that environment. After Harry's death, the halo doesn't disappear, it hardens. Harry's boy becomes shorthand for competence, dedication, control. So when patterns around Dexter look strange, the investigation bends around him instead of toward him. Pattern interrupt. Imagine the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force with no Harry Morgan in their collective memory. Does Dexter ever get that much benefit of the doubt? Do Masuka and Lagerta joke with him in the lab? Or does someone quietly pull his file the first time a coincidence feels wrong? Each major section will keep circling this unsettling reality. Miami Metro isn't just outsmarted by Dexter, it co-authors the rulebook he uses against them. The code is written in Harry's handwriting, but the ink is institutional habit, professional respect, and a shared fantasy that the real danger is always out there, never smiling behind a Miami Metro ID badge. And once we see that, the next collapse becomes inevitable. What happens when that invisible predator stops following the code at all? When Dexter stops following the code, he doesn't step out of Miami Metro's blind spot. He sinks deeper into it. Because the double life that should make him visible is the exact structure that keeps him hidden. Let's kick things off with the basic architecture of that disguise. By day, he's the quiet blood spatter tech. Then he's Rita's attentive boyfriend, later the suburban husband, eventually the exhausted father juggling Harrison and night shifts. Each role explains away behavior that, in any other context, would trigger an investigation. Vanishing at odd hours? That's just a demanding job. Emotional distance? Must be childhood trauma. Missed calls and sudden disappearances? Parenting? Stress? Maybe compassion fatigue? In this video, we're going to sit with that psychology of normalcy. Miami Metro runs on a culture where stress, insomnia, and compartmentalization are badges of honor. Everyone is overworked. Everyone is haunted. So when Dexter drifts through the bullpen with that 1,000-yard stare, It reads as empathy burnout, not predatory focus. The very environment that should detect anomalies is calibrated to ignore them. To keep this clear, we can track the moments when someone actually feels the glitch. Dokes watches Dexter slip away from crime scenes and narrows his eyes. Batista notices how Dexter always seems to orbit the major cases. Deb clocks that her brother's stories never quite line up. But each time, the suspicion hits a wall of rationalization. He's a lab rat, not a field guy. He's a victim of trauma, not a source of it. He's a new husband with a baby at home. Of course, he's distracted. Look at Season 1's Ice Truck Killer investigation. Dexter is visibly rattled, personally targeted, disappearing into his own head. Deb reads it as her sweet brother being overwhelmed by a case that mirrors their past. When he zones out at her promotion celebration, no one asks, "Is our blood guy in direct communication with the killer?" They ask, "Is he okay?" Concern replaces scrutiny. The pattern repeats with Trinity. Dexter's erratic schedule, mysterious absences, and sudden obsession with Kyle Butler all get folded into the narrative of a man under pressure. A husband trying to keep his marriage from collapsing. A new father drowning in responsibility. His emotional entanglements are real, but they also function as noise. Every fight with Rita, every awkward date, every parenting crisis creates plausible chaos that scrambles any clean pattern in his movements. And that's the core failure. Miami Metro believes in neat categories: cop, civilian, killer, victim, witness, suspect. As long as Dexter can occupy the first two convincingly, the third never computes. Someone who is both cannot exist inside their mental model of the job, so the evidence of that hybrid identity is constantly refiled as overwork, grief, or garden variety weirdness. Along the way, that belief system doesn't just miss Dexter, it actively protects him. Which raises the central question for the next collapse. What happens when someone inside the department finally refuses to accept those categories at face value? When someone finally refuses those categories, we don't get a breakthrough. We get the same trap, reset with a new face. Different season, different killer, same institutional reflex, pulling everything back into place. To keep this clear, look at the recurring design of Miami Metro's failures. Brian, Miguel, Trinity, Hannah, 4 very different predators, 4 very similar points of entry. Brian doesn't just taunt the department. He dates Deborah, walks into the bullpen with flowers, and absorbs their rhythms from the inside. Miguel doesn't just cross paths with Dexter. He's an assistant Da whose friendship with the golden boy blood guy buys him instant trust, instant access, instant cover. Trinity is the church-going family man who becomes a civic cause for Lundy's task force, orbiting their investigation while they profile everything except the man standing in front of them. Hannah enters as a witness, then a suspect, then Dexter's lover. Moving from interview room to bedroom without ever leaving the investigation's shadow. The focus is not just on killers getting close. It's on how the department keeps rewarding that proximity. The closer you are to Miami Metro, the safer you become. Because proximity reads as credibility, and credibility becomes armor. How many times do we watch the real threat sit in on briefings about themselves? Meanwhile, the system keeps manufacturing convenient suspects. When the Bay Harbor Butcher case heats up, all that unease about Dexter's late nights and perfect analyses gets poured into Dokes. He's angry. He's isolated. He already thinks something's wrong. Perfect scapegoat. With Trinity, the manhunt keeps landing on random truckers, cult members, and low-level accomplices, while Arthur Mitchell literally hugs Deborah in a support group. Miguel weaponizes this pattern outright, nudging investigations toward rival gang members and political enemies, knowing the department will accept any narrative that gives them a public win. How many times do we see a press conference before we see the truth? Each new task force arrives with a speech about doing things differently. Lundy's task force, LaGuardia's Bay Harbor Butcher Board, the Trinity investigation, the Hannah McKay case. Fresh photos, fresh coffee, fresh promises. But the blind spots are inherited like furniture, overconfidence in their own read of the psychology, obsession with how the case plays in the media. Internal politics about who gets credit and who takes the fall. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between stated reform and actual behavior, because that's where the real collapse happens. And even when someone like LaGuardia starts to see the pattern, Dexter at the docks, the slide box, the improbably neat resolutions, the institution moves to protect itself. Her Bay Harbor Butcher reinvestigation is treated as a threat, not a lead. Colleagues, close ranks, evidence is reframed, and the possibility that the original story was wrong becomes more dangerous than any killer still walking free. So the names on the case files change, the task force photos come down and go back up, but the way Miami Metro loses stays eerily consistent. Which leaves one more question hanging over Dexter's entire trajectory. What happens when that same unlearned lesson finally turns on him instead of saving him? Because when we finally get to Dexter's endgame, that unlearned lesson is all that's left. The myth of control. The fantasy that every kill, every contingency, every bloodslide was part of a meticulous plan instead of a barely managed crisis. Let's kick things off by stripping that myth down. Dexter tells us he's a master planner. Stalk, confirm, prepare the room. No mistakes. But when we actually track the trajectory of his kills, what do we see? A brother he never anticipated. A sergeant locked in a cage because the investigation got too close. A Trinity copycat spiraling out of his grasp. Again and again, the plan is Dexter improvising around failures he didn't predict and consequences he can't fully control. In this video, we're going to sit with an uncomfortable contrast. On paper, Dexter is the meticulous blood spatter analyst who weaponizes procedure and the code to stay safe. In practice, he survives because Miami Metro repeatedly misreads the very patterns he creates. The Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force leans on his analysis to hunt him. Dokes is profiled as the threat because he looks dangerous, while the quiet lab tech with perfect access to evidence is cleared. The focus is not just on Dexter's intelligence, but on the institution that keeps grading his homework and calling it objective truth. To keep this clear, look at how often a collapse is avoided not by design, but by someone else's failure. Leela blowing up Dokes instead of Miami Metro following the chain of custody. Quinn backing off when he's inches from the truth because internal politics and half-proved leads make him look paranoid. Deb walking into that church at the exact wrong moment, then spending an entire season rewriting the investigation in her head rather than following the evidence to her brother. Dexter's control is propped up by blind spots he didn't create, but absolutely exploits. And then Iron Lake breaks the pattern. In New Blood, Dexter is finally exposed not by Miami Metro's long-running investigation, but by a small-town chief, a podcaster, and his own son. Angela Bishop builds a better Bay Harbor Butcher case with a printer, a USB stick, and a conscience than LaGuardia ever did with a full task force. Harrison, not Harry's code, becomes the final arbiter of consequences. When he pulls the trigger, it's the clearest verdict the series ever gives on Dexter's psychology. The control he worshipped was never real, and the people he claimed to protect no longer believe the story. Here's the pattern interrupt. Miami Metro only learns the full truth as a footnote, a file on Angela's desk, a distant scandal, not a solved case. So the central question becomes brutal. If Dexter's long-term success depended on an institution this flawed, was he a genius predator or just lucky about his hunting ground? Once he steps outside those cracks, the illusion collapses instantly. By the end, Dexter isn't the master of the code. He's the product of systemic failure. A serial killer whose legend could only exist inside Miami Metro's blind spots, and whose control evaporates the second those walls fall away. So what happens if we flip the camera? If, instead of tracking one meticulous serial killer, we treat Miami Metro itself as the main character, a glass-walled protagonist, stumbling from investigation to investigation, convinced it's in control, while the world quietly proves otherwise. In this video, we're going to lean into that thought experiment. Imagine a rewatch where the eye of Dexter's narration dissolves and the squad room becomes the real center of gravity. The central question stops being, will Dexter get away with it? And becomes, how far can this institution's denial stretch before it breaks? Suddenly, every case is not just a mystery, but another chapter in a long, slow institutional collapse. Let's kick things off with the emotional trajectory. Season 1. Miami Metro is confident, energized, almost proud as the ice truck killer taunts them. They build task forces, hold press conferences, trade theories under fluorescent lights. From their perspective, this is the big show, the investigation that proves their competence. But we know Brian is playing them, leaving body parts and coded messages they consistently misread, while the real story is his private game with Dexter that the department never even sees. Then the Bay Harbor Butcher case hits. On paper, it's their defining challenge, the moment the system turns inward. In practice, it's humiliation. They build an entire task force on Dexter's blood work, let him steer the profile, and end up railroading Dokes because the narrative is convenient. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on the wrong suspect, but on the way the institution chooses the path of least psychological resistance rather than face the consequences of the truth in its own lab. By the time Laguerta starts circling Dexter, the show almost lets Miami Metro wake up. Her private investigation, the blood slide, the container, this is the closest the protagonist ever comes to self-awareness. For one brief stretch, the squad room's blind spots are personified in a single detective who refuses to look away. And then she dies on a dock, and the institution absorbs the shock by doing what it does best, rewriting the story, filing the doubt away, promoting Deb, and moving on. Seen through this lens, celebrations turn ominous. Every cake in the break room, every applause line at a promotion feels like a missed chance for reflection. Background characters, Masuka, the uniforms, the techs, become tragic, not comic, because their competence is constantly redirected into the wrong plan, the wrong suspect, the wrong conclusion. In a city obsessed with image and sunshine, the darkest arc is happening in plain sight, inside that transparent cube of offices where no one truly sees. Along the way, killers walk through those glass doors as consultants, friends, even heroes, and the squad still believes the next big case will redeem the last failure. So if Miami Metro is the tragic lead, which of their collapses hits you hardest on rewatch? Ice Truck, Bay Harbor, LaGuerta, or the quiet fade out after Dexter's supposed death? So if Miami Metro is the tragic lead, which of their collapses hits you hardest on rewatch? Ice Truck, Bay Harbor, LaGuerta, or the quiet fade out after Dexter's supposed death? Let's kick things off in this final stretch by pulling those failures back into one frame and asking what they reveal about the department's psychology. not just its paperwork. From dismembered mannequins in pastel hotel rooms to bloodless bodies on ice, the ice truck killer spends an entire season writing a message in corpses. Miami Metro reads it as a standard escalation pattern. Dexter reads it as a personal invitation. That gap is the whole show. Then, the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation leans on Dexter's own analysis to chase a phantom, until pressure, politics, and convenience turn Dokes into the perfect scapegoat. A decorated cop is framed, the real killer is sitting in the lab, and the task force celebrates a win that is, in reality, a total collapse of the investigation. Miguel Prado walks in as grieving royalty, weaponizes LaGuerta's loyalty, manipulates case files, and uses the department's hunger for closure to hide his own kills. Trinity appears as a suburban ghost, a family man hiding in plain sight, while Miami Metro builds task forces, holds briefings, and still misses the monster, living one step outside their profile. Doomsday spirals into vigilante theater while they chase the wrong disciple. The brain surgeon dances through New Blood's shadows while legacy law enforcement repeats the same patterns. And in the end, they accept Dexter's death with a body that is never truly confirmed, a narrative that feels neat, and a case file that quietly closes. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on individual errors, it's on a consistent trajectory where killers exploit the same blind spots, deference to experts, pressure from the media, the need for a clean story that restores control. Harry's code fails Dexter. Miami Metro's institutional code fails the city. Together, they create a world where illusion beats evidence again and again. So now the central question is yours. Which investigation is Miami Metro's most unforgivable failure? Misreading ice truck's messages, the Bay Harbor Butcher frame-up of Dokes, Miguel's rise under their protection, Trinity's reign in plain sight, the doomsday misdirection, the brain surgeon slipping through, or that quiet acceptance of Dexter's off-screen death. If you had been in that transparent cube of offices, what clue would you have followed that they ignored? Who would you have actually suspected? And where do you think the real turning point was in this whole chain of collapse? Drop your verdict in the comments and be specific about the moment the investigation could have pivoted but didn't. Along the way, tell us which other crime shows you want to see under this same microscope. Where else do the police think they're in control while the monsters write the plan? In this video, we're going to stay with Dexter, but a future breakdown might put Miami Metro side by side with those other departments and ask whether anyone on TV is really solving the case or just narrating their own failure.